Chapter 966. When Yi Qianshan heard that, she got angry and said, "Why don't you keep him for the new year?" Yu Lily chuckled and felt the heat from the stove. Her eyes were empty. Yi Qianshan felt something was wrong. She looked at her and asked, "Did your boyfriend scold you like that?" "Don't. Let's talk about it. Don't break up. Otherwise it will be bad if he blames me in the future." "We already broke up." Yu Lily turned her head and picked up the egg noodles and vegetables. She slowly processed them and said, "We can't wait for the new year. There are more important things to do during the new year." "Well?" Yi Qianshan felt something was wrong. "Really? What?" "Traveling during the new year." Yu Lily put the noodles in and looked at Yi Qianshan with a smile. "Do you have any plans? If you don't, how about traveling together?" "Sure." Yi Qianshan looked excited. "When is the new year?" "During the new year, between the first and second day of the new year." "Well?" The smile on Yi Qianshan's face gradually disappeared. "No, I have to go home. I haven't been home all year. If I don't go home during the new year, my mother will kill me." "I understand." Yu Lily looked at the steam rising from the pot while cooking the noodles. She looked down and said, "I'm just saying. I used to travel alone." When she wasn't with Ming, she worked part-time during the new year. During the years when she was with Ming, she went everywhere during the new year. After she broke up with Ming, Yu Lily spent the next few years walking and stopping. As she walked, she painted and sometimes she felt sad. Originally, she thought that she wouldn't be able to make it through the new year. Unexpectedly, she was still alive and well. Yi Qianshan felt a little sorry for Yu Lily, but she didn't say it. She quickly changed the topic. They ate the noodles together. After washing the dishes, Yu Lily went back to her room to paint. But she was really not in a good mood. Yu Lily lay on the bed, picked up the headphones, plugged them in, and turned on the monitor plug-in in Shin Manting's phone. Shin Manting seemed to be on her way home. There was the sound of cars driving and honking. At the same time, there was the sound of the car radio. After about half an hour, it finally quieted down. Yu Lily could clearly hear the sound of Shin Manting's high heels, the sound of her entering the password, and the sound of the door opening. However, after Shin Manting closed the door, she exclaimed in surprise. Even Yu Lily felt a little creeped out by the sound. Then she opened her mouth and shouted, Big brother, why are you here?" "Big brother? That's Shin Luo, and right?" She pricked up her ears and heard the man's footsteps. Shin Manting retreated in fear. Then she heard the sound of something being hit. "Big brother, don't," Shin Manting said in a sobbing voice. You said that as long as I get married before this year you will." Yu Lily was shocked and looked up. Was Shin Manting in danger? However, wasn't the other party Big Brother? Why was there such a sound? "Shu." Shin Luo, Anne's voice was unexpectedly pleasant to the ears. It was like a thick subwoofer. "I said that as long as you get married before this year, I won't touch you." Chapter 967. In Yu Lily's heart there was a word that was running amok. Asterisk 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 asterisk. She seemed to have stumbled upon a huge secret. But then Shin Manting's bag seemed to be thrown far away. After several collisions, Yu Lily could hear the sound over there, but she couldn't hear it clearly. Shin Luo and took the bag from Shin Manting's hand and threw it into the room. The bag rolled from the sofa to under the coffee table, far away from them. Shin Manting looked at Shin Luo and in front of her in horror and kept shrinking back. Shin Luo and saw Shin Manting like this, and his eyes were a bit gentle, but his actions were overbearing. He approached her step by step and said, "But Ming doesn't like you at all. Can't you see it?" Shin Manting looked at him with red eyes and said, "I will get married this year, and my grandmother also hopes that I will get married before this year. I can't let her down. Brother, you should give up. We are brother and sister." Shin Luo and smiled as usual, gentle as jade. However, he stretched out his hands and placed them on both sides of her body. He leaned forward and said in a threatening manner, "What kind of brother and sister are we? You know very well that we aren't related by blood. It's just my wishful thinking that allowed me to recognize you. You also know that my brain isn't that good." Shin Manting shrank back in fear and almost cried out. She shouted, "Brother, you can't do this." Shin Luo and suddenly approached her and pressed her against him. Shin Manting groaned and turned her head away. Shin Luo and said, "When I asked you to choose between Li Xiqing, Ming, and me, you should have chosen me instead of that playboy. Now do you regret it?" "Brother, don't do this." Shin Manting was about to cry. "Don't be afraid." Shin Luo and was obviously a lot calmer. "I mean what I say." Shin Luo An's gentle eyes were stained with sharpness. He squatted down and looked her in the eyes. But you'd better be clean. Don't let me find out about this dirty trick again. Shin Manting looked up in shock. How did you? Don't be too lucky. I know everything. Shin Luo, and looked at her deeply. Then the sound of his footsteps faded away and the door was closed. She finally heaved a sigh of relief, but the fear and guilt in her heart overflowed. How could this be? How could this be? Shin Manting's body gradually collapsed and she leaned against the door. After a long time, she got up from the ground and stumbled over to find her cell phone to make a call. Yu Lily hadn't heard anything just now. Now that Shin Manting picked up the phone, she could hear the voice on the other end. What should I do? Big brother is looking for me again? Yu Lily did not expect to hear such a big secret. Shin Manting and Shin Luo, and have some kind of ambiguous relationship? But wasn't Yi Yu married to Shin Luo and? Shin Luo, and had an affair with his own sister? What a mess. Yu Lily felt that her brain capacity wasn't enough. She stood up abruptly and subconsciously wanted to tell Yi Qianqian about it. Chapter 968. If I'm found out, will I be treated as a pervert? Yu Lily felt a little distressed and frowned. While she was hesitating, Yi Qianqian's door was suddenly opened. She was caught off guard and saw a person standing at the door. Yi Qianqian's heart skipped a beat and she jumped back. When he saw that it was Yu Lily, he was scared out of his wits. You scared me to death. What are you doing here? Yu Lily was also shocked. Faced with Yi Qianqian's question, she couldn't help feeling guilty. Well, what am I doing here? Yu Lily didn't know how to explain herself. After thinking for a while, she still couldn't think of what to say. She saw Yi Qianqian's face was strange. She approached cautiously step by step, looked at her suspiciously and said, Are you gay? And a gay voyeur. Yu Lily narrowed her eyes and said, Even if I'm gay, I won't like this kind of person. Hearing that, Yi Qianqian's face puffed up. She looked unconvinced and said angrily, What's wrong with me? How am I bad? I have breasts and a butt. I'm not bad at all. Yu Lily looked suspicious and shook her head. I really can't see how you are not bad. Yi Qianqian received a critical hit and almost beat her up, but she quickly snorted and said, By the way, why are you looking for me? Oh, I just want to see if you are asleep. If you are not, let's go for a night run? Yi Qianqian looked desperate and said, Why do we have to go for a night run? Snacks are not good? Korean dramas are not good? Mobile phones are not fun? Why do we have to go for a night run? Yu Lily was speechless and turned around, but she was still curious and asked, You said that your sister married Shin Luo An. How is her relationship with Shin Luo An? How would I know? I'm not interested in their life. I am a single dog, so I don't need to pay so much attention to it. Otherwise I will be abused to tears. Yu Lily looked at her sympathetically. Suddenly she smirked and asked, Girl, are you still a virgin? Yi Qianqian was speechless. No way, really? How old are you? 26, 27, 28, scram. Hey, you're angry from embarrassment. Tell me, how old are you? However, Yu Lily's response was a loud slam of the door, followed by an earth-shattering cry. Oh my God, there's no justice in this day and age. It's my fault that I'm single. Yu Lily smiled and walked back to the room. Yi Qianqian lay on the bed for a long time. She scratched her head and picked up her cell phone to call Yi Yu. The phone rang for a long time before Yi Yu picked it up. It sounded like she was sleeping. Hello. Yi Yu turned on the light to clear her head. Yi Qianqian's voice sounded a little strange. She asked, How is your relationship with Shin Luo An? When Yi Yu heard the question, she perked up. Sitting up from the bed, Yi Yu asked, You never care about the things between me and brother Luo An. Why do you ask this now? Chapter 969. Yes. That girl seems to be very interested in the relationship between you and Shin Luo An, Yi Qianqian said. Yi Yu heard the excitement in her words and exposed her disdainfully. You are curious yourself. Why do you push it to others? Yi Qianqian smiled and said, Half and half. Tell me quickly. I don't know if it's good or not. Since we got married, he has never slept with me. Yi Qianqian was shocked and exclaimed, No way. Yi Yu nodded and felt frustrated. Besides, he has never hugged me or kissed me. Every time I go back, he just looks at me and asks, You're back? Then he has nothing to say. Oh my God. How can you not have feelings? You have no feelings at all. Yi Qianqian exclaimed. How can you tolerate it? Otherwise, he always tells me that he is not ready and asks me to wait. Yi Yu's voice was already crying. Sister, you also think it's abnormal, right? Nonsense. It's so abnormal. Yi Chanshan gave her a big supercilious look and said, "It's lucky that you didn't lose your temper. If it were me, I might have slept with him that night. What does it mean to let you live like a widow?" While speaking, it seemed that she thought of something and said, "Is it because of the old woman of the Shen family? That old woman told him not to touch you? Not to sleep with you?" Yi Yuyu paused and also felt that it was very possible. The more Yi Chanshan thought about it, the more confused she became. She scolded, "Damn it, that old woman. She thinks she is an eminent monk and goes around telling people's fortunes. I think Brother Luo, and doesn't like you at all. He just uses the old woman's power to force you to divorce." However, after Yi Chanshan said this, she noticed that something was wrong. Hearing the silence on the other side, Yi Chanshan quickly explained and said, No, I said something wrong. You don't think too much, sister." Yi Yuyu interrupted Yi Chanshan's words. "I know that Brother Luo, and doesn't like me, but he doesn't like anyone else, right? As long as I can be with him, I will be satisfied." When her voice fell, the phone vibrated. She picked it up and saw that it was a call from Li Jinan. When Yi Chanshan heard what Yi Yuyu said, she sighed and said, "You silly girl. Why aren't you sleeping? It's already past 11. Get ready, sleep early, good night." "Good night." Yi Yuyu hung up on Yi Chanshan and answered Li Jinan's call. "GM Li, do you still want your wedding ring?" Li Jinan's voice sounded nonchalant. She could even imagine his nonchalant expression. It was as if he didn't care about anything. "Of course. Come and get it yourself. Come to my office tomorrow." With that, he hung up the phone. Yi Yuyu didn't have time to say anything. Naturally, she didn't have time to reject him either. Looking at the phone, Yi Yuyu thought about what Yi Chanshan had just said. Her emotions were complicated. By the time Yi Yuyu arrived at the NC headquarters, it was already past 10 a.m. Chapter 970. Yi Yuyu sat inside and played with her phone. After a few minutes, she heard something outside. Li Jinan's voice came through the door. At the same time, there was a familiar voice. Yi Yuyu's body stiffened. She stood inside and looked outside. Li Jinan was wearing a straight and beautiful long windbreaker. He wore a thin white shirt inside, which showed off his healthy and strong body. And Li Jinan had a characteristic. He didn't wear a suit like many people. Relatively speaking, he dressed much more casually than many people, but he was very handsome. Perhaps because he had been in the army, Li Jinan gave people an indescribable sharpness at first glance. But if you looked closely, you would find that the sharpness had been restrained. When you looked again, it was like the clouds and the wind, and his eyes were as clear as the moon. Just behind Li Jinan, a man walked up as well. He was wearing a black coat, a dark gray scarf, dark gray trousers and pitch black leather shoes. He was slightly shorter than Li Jinan, but he was still very tall. His facial features were clear and his eyes were like stars. He didn't smile, but he was naturally charming. It's him. It was the man that Yi Yuyu had loved for 10 years, Shen Luo Han. Shen Luo, and sat opposite Li Jinan, and the secretary quickly came in with coffee. Yi Yuyu had mixed feelings. Seeing Shen Luo, and there, she inexplicably didn't dare to go out. What? Even Yi Yuyu didn't know. She turned back to the sofa and her heart was in a mess. Hearing the two men talking outside, Yi Yuyu felt a little strange. One was her husband whom she loved deeply, and the other was her boss whom she had a one-night stand with. And she was hiding in her boss's office, not daring to go out. What is this situation? Yi Yuyu looked in the mirror in front of her. The delicate makeup on her face made her already beautiful features even more beautiful. But I am so beautiful. Why doesn't Shen Luo and feel anything for me? Mr. Shen, I seem to have heard some rumors recently. It seems that you are married? Li Jinan looked indifferent. He looked at Shen Luo and in front of him and asked casually as he drank his coffee with a smile. When Shen Luo and heard this, he smiled faintly and asked, "Who told you that?" "I forgot about that. After all, once the news comes out, everyone will hear it. Towards the end, it will become more and more distorted." Shen Luo and smile widened as he said, "No. No." Li Jinan gently put his hand into his coat pocket. His long fingers gently rubbed the ring lying in the pocket. His eyes fell on Shen Luo and's hand. Shen Luo and's hands were unadorned. As if sensing Li Jinan's gaze, Shen Luo and extended his hand and waved it as he said, "I'm not married." Li Jinan had a look of understanding on his face. He nodded his head and said, "So that's how it is. It looks like the rumors out there can't be trusted after all." "Of course." Shen Luo and took a sip of coffee and smiled. When Yi Yuyu heard Shen Luo and's reply, She still felt very disappointed, even though it was within her expectations. Yu didn't listen to what they said next. She clutched her arms and shrank into a ball in the lounge. She didn't dare go out. Chapter 971. Did you hear all that? Li Jinan put his hands in his pockets and said, he said he's not married. Yu held her hands together and bit her lower lip. She had mixed feelings. Yes, he's not married. In Shinluo, Anne's heart, maybe marriage is just a process. Why should I care so much? I don't care. As long as I can be with him, it's okay. It doesn't matter whether there is love or not. The word marriage has tied the two of them together. Unless she was willing, they would never be able to separate. The initiative is in my hands, isn't it? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Li Jinan noticed the change in her mood. His eyes were as deep as water. He slowly said, he said he doesn't have a lover. Those few words easily reminded her of what he had said to her when she had threatened to kill herself to force him to marry her. He had said, Yu, I can marry you, but I won't love you. I can't love you anymore. I can't love anymore. Because of her threat, he could marry her, but he wouldn't love her. At that time she didn't think it mattered, but she ignored the most terrible human nature, greed. Now that she was married to him, she wanted more. Yu glared at him, stood up abruptly and ran out. Her eyes couldn't stop burning. Yu bit her lower lip and pressed the elevator button to go downstairs. Li Jinan looked at her back and looked down at the wedding ring on his finger. He felt a little helpless. Didn't she come to get the ring? Now she hasn't even gotten the ring and she's already running away? After Yu got out of the elevator, she ran out of the door and could see Shinluo, Anne's back from a distance. It was so familiar, so straight. Yu stopped. Shinluo, and didn't notice that Yu was behind him. He was looking down at the news that had just been pushed out on his phone. Everyone is happy. The daughter of the Shin family announces the good news of her marriage with Ming. It will be before the new year. Shinluo, and looked at the news, smiled gently and muttered to himself, can't wait? Or is it just to warn me? Yu watched Shinluo, and walk away. Her feet seemed to be nailed and she couldn't move. Not far away from them, there was a big screen in front of them that was scrolling through the news. And the most eye-catching news was the big news about the marriage between the young master of the O clan and the young master of the Shin clan. So, Shin Manting is getting married? Yu felt a sense of relief. Happiness crept onto her face. When Lily saw this message, her hands that were typing suddenly stopped. Looking at the 10-cent news push in the lower right corner, Lily moved the mouse and clicked on the news. There were only pictures of Ming and a selfie of Shin Manting. That's great, they're getting married. On the 23rd of the 12th month, they could celebrate the new year right after they got married. Lily's mood was indescribably gloomy. They had already broken up, so why did she still care so much? Lily closed the webpage and was about to continue working when the new receptionist outside shouted, Lily, someone is looking for you. Lily looked up but didn't see who it was. He stood up and walked outside. However, the first thing he saw wasn't a person, but a huge bouquet of pink roses. Seeing the roses, Lily was a little surprised. Chapter 972. Shin Jilia's facial features were very good-looking and well-defined. At first glance he was a bit deep. When Lily saw him, she frowned, then turned around and walked inside. Shin Jilia immediately greeted her and shouted, Lily, this is for you. However, Lily's pace quickened as she ran further inside. Shin Jilia immediately followed her and shouted, Lily, don't be so cruel. Give me a chance. Her colleagues all looked over with a bit of ambiguity and ridicule in their eyes. When Lily met his gaze, she became even more impatient. She turned around and shouted, Are you done yet? Are you done? Shin Jilia took the opportunity to put the roses in her arms and said with a smile, Look, it's over. Yi Chanshan was pouring water. When she heard the movement here, she came in with a glass of water and said with envy, Wow, what a beautiful flower. Lily, is this your boyfriend? He is so handsome. Shin Jilia was actually very proud of being praised in such a way. However, in front of Lily he still had to pretend to be a little reserved. Looking at Yi Chanshan, Shin Jilia smiled and said, You flatter me. Lily put the roses back, looked at Yi Chanshan and said, This is not my boyfriend. Then she quickly walked back inside. Shin Jilia almost dropped the roses, but he quickly caught them and held them in his arms. He walked in and said, My good Lily, don't be angry. Let's go to dinner together later. Many people turned to look at him enviously. Especially Shan Yu. Shan Yu wore thick black-rimmed glasses, and her clothes were very ordinary and affordable sportswear. She was a little fat. She looked a little rustic, but she had just graduated from college and was 2 years younger than Yu Lily. At this moment she looked at Shinjilia and couldn't move her eyes away. Yu Lily noticed Shan Yu's gaze and turned to glare at Shinjilia. She said, "This is an office area. Please don't disturb other people's work here, okay?" Many people looked at Shinjilia with sympathy. Shinjilia touched his nose and said, "You mean that you promised me to have dinner with you later? Alright, I'll wait for you outside first." Without giving Yu Lily a chance to refuse, Shinjilia put down the roses and turned to leave. Yu Lily looked at the roses with disgust and threw them into the trash can. Shan Yu looked at the bouquet of roses and felt that it was a pity. The tender and alluring petals were very fresh and beautiful. Yu Lily didn't notice Shan Yu's gaze, but Yi Qianqian did. Yi Qianqian noticed Shan Yu's gaze. She pretended to hold the coffee, walked to Yu Lily's seat and said, "Is this really your boyfriend?" Wow, Yu Lily really hides her strength. She didn't bring such a handsome man out to meet her sisters. That's not good enough. I told you he's not my boyfriend. Yu Lily felt a little helpless. She looked up at her and said, "This guy is the one who caused me to break up with my boyfriend." She's AB*TC. Chapter 973. Yu Lily glanced at her, picked up the flowers and handed them to Yi Qianqian. "Here." Yi Qianqian held the flowers and smelled them. "They smell so good." She looked at Shan Yu and said, "Why don't we share them together?" Shan Yu looked at the bunch of flowers, but she quickly looked away. She pouted her lips with disdain and said, "I'm not that cheap. Why should we share what others don't want?" The expression on Yi Qianqian's face suddenly froze. Many people heard Shan Yu's words. Suddenly, there seemed to be an unspeakable awkwardness in the air. When Yu Lily heard this, she felt a little inexplicable, but she was angry and looked at Shan Yu. However, Shan Yu didn't realize what she had done wrong at all. Facing everyone's eyes, she looked puzzled and asked, "Did I say something wrong?" Yi Qianqian smiled and looked at the roses in her hand. She didn't know whether to put them down or take them. Yu Lily took the flowers and said, "Such a big thing. Why don't we each have one? It's very fresh." Yu Lily took the flowers out and gave one to each of her colleagues. There were still a dozen left. Yu Lily found a bottle and put it in front of her. "Look, I still have the most. Qianqian, come here. I'll give you a few more." Yi Qianqian looked at Yu Lily gratefully, took it and said, "Thank you, Lily." Many people could see that Yi Qianqian thanked Yu Lily not for the flowers, but for helping her out. Shan Yu, on the other hand, was much more straightforward. She put the roses on the keyboard. Seeing Yu Lily's behavior, she muttered, "Hypocrite." Yu Lily was angry. She slammed the table and stood up. Everyone was taken aback by Yu Lily's imposing manner, but Yi Qianqian managed to calm them down. Yi Qianqian laughed and said, "Time's up. Let's eat." "Lily, I suddenly want to eat the fat cow across the street. Let's go together?" Yu Lily was furious and annoyed. She turned to look at Yi Qianqian only to see her winking at her. Yi Qianqian kept winking at her. She pulled Yu Lily up and said, "Let's go." As soon as they were out, Yu Lily yelled out, "Is that woman sick? She's retarded. There's something wrong with her brain." Shinjilia heard Yu Lily's voice from afar. He rushed over and asked, "What's going on? What's wrong?" When Yu Lily saw Shinjilia, she felt even angrier. She roared, "Why are you here? Are you so free? Don't you need to go to work? Aren't you a psychologist? Is it fun to dress up like this all day to pick up girls? Are you crazy?" Shinjilia was dumbfounded by the yelling. He looked at Yi Qianqian with a confused expression. Yi Qianqian pulled Yu Lily back, smiled apologetically and said, "It's okay. She was just angry. It's not a big deal." After venting, Yu Lily was in a much better mood. However, seeing Shinjilia still annoyed her. She pulled Yi Qianqian along and walked out of the office. Shinjilia immediately caught up and gestured to Yi Qianqian. "What's going on?" She shrugged her shoulders, shook her head, and sighed with an indescribable expression. Chapter 974. Yi Qianqian immediately followed Shinjilia and Yu Lily to the stone pot beef shop that they had mentioned earlier. Shan Yu looked at the backs of Yi Qianqian and Yu Lily, feeling very unconvinced. Shan Yu is Yi Qianqian's assistant. Why is Yu Lily Ziyu's assistant, so close to Yi Qianqian? Now Yi Qianqian is the queen of performance in the company, and a large part of the company's traffic is brought back by Yi Qianqian. But Shan Yu didn't learn anything from her. It must be because Yi Qianqian taught Yu Lily all the time. Even Editor-in-Chief Zhou said that the next candidate for the position of editor was more inclined to Yu Lily. And last time I accidentally saw Yu Lily's computer, it seems that there is a relationship between her and Yi Qianqian, right? There was jealousy in Shan Yu's eyes. When she thought of how Yu Lily almost jumped up and beat her, she felt angry. Why can Yu Lily get in through the back door? I'll get rid of you sooner or later. Shinjilia followed Yu Lily and Yi Chanshan into a restaurant and sat down. His incongruous style made Shinjilia attract a lot of attention. Feeling the eyes of the girls around him, Shinjilia smiled to show his politeness. When Yu Lily saw it, she sneered and said, "If you can laugh so much, why are you a psychiatrist? Go sell your laughter." Shinjilia asked, "Did you eat dynamite today?" Yi Chanshan looked at Shinjilia with her eyes shining and said, "So you are a psychiatrist?" Shinjilia was a little proud to receive the admiration of a girl. He smiled coquettishly. Shinjilia nodded and said, "Yes, now I work while going to school." "Wow, that's amazing." Yi Chanshan looked at him with eyes full of admiration and said, "Do you know hypnosis? I heard that not all psychiatrists can hypnotize people. It seems that the ability of hypnosis is also divided into different levels, right?" Shinjilia nodded and said, "Yes, because everyone's understanding, realm, and spiritual level are different." Yu Lily watched him enter the bragging mode with her own eyes, but she didn't interrupt him. She silently drank her tea and after ordering the food she handed it to Yi Chanshan and said, "Order as much as you can. He'll pay the bill." Yi Chanshan looked at the price list and then at the pink suit Shinjilia was wearing. Come on, how much money could there be in this kind of place even if they tried their best? Moreover, she didn't fit in with this young master who looked like a rich man at first glance. Yi Chanshan circled one and handed the menu back to Shinjilia. After ordering, Shinjilia continued to brag. Yi Chanshan listened attentively and was stunned by his professional knowledge. After they finished eating, Yi Chanshan was reluctant to leave. Her eyes sparkled as she listened to Shinjilia recount all the case studies. She quickly parted ways with Shinjilia. His voice was still echoing in her head. She looked at Yu Lily and said, "Lily, I think I can study psychology too. It's so interesting." Yu Lily laughed out loud and gave her a push. After working the entire afternoon, Yi Chanshan didn't ride her bike to her destination after work. Instead, he walked back home after arguing with Yu Lily. When she got home it was 6:30 and it was already dark. Chapter 975. The man was meticulously dressed. His burgundy suit had been carefully ironed, and it was very neat and clean. At that moment, he leaned against the Bentley with a cigarette between his long fingers. When he saw them coming he put out the cigarette by the trash can not far away and stood up straight. It was Ming. When Yu Lily saw him, the smile on her face disappeared. When Yi Chanshan saw Ming, she recognized him at a glance. Seeing him, Yi Chanshan felt a little strange. "I can't believe I see such a person at the entrance of my own community. But what is this guy doing here?" Yi Chanshan turned to look at Yu Lily with a face full of gossip. When she was about to speak, she found that Yu Lily was also looking at Ming with a solemn face. Yi Chanshan suddenly had a bad guess and said, "Could it be?" Yu Lily looked at Yi Chanshan and said, "You go up first. I have something to do." Yi Chanshan was stunned and couldn't believe it. It was amazing that she knew Li Jinan and a psychiatrist, but Yu Lily actually knew Ming. Oh my god, is there a need to live? And from the looks of it, her relationship with Ming isn't ordinary. This Yu Lily has too many secrets on her. When Yi Chanshan heard Yu Lily's words, she looked at Yu Lily and then looked at Ming and said weakly, "Then I'll go up first." Okay. Yi Chanshan led her little donkey into the community. She looked back every few steps, but Yu Lily was not in a hurry to walk in Ming's direction. This is really making Yi Chanshan anxious. Yu Lily looked at Ming in front of her and smiled. She walked forward and said, "Congratulations, you're getting married soon." Ming saw her smile, but he didn't feel happy at all. He couldn't help but reach out his hand. He looked at her and said, "Yu Lily." "Yes." Yu Lily looked at Ming and slightly raised her eyebrows. "What's wrong?" Ming looked at her, pulled her into his arms and said, "I won't marry her. Give me a little more time, and I will marry you openly and let you be my wife." Yu Lily slightly raised her face and leaned on his shoulder. His heart felt as though it was being twisted and it was aching. But on the surface he smiled and said, Ming." His voice was calm with a gentle smile. However, this kind of voice made Ming feel even more uncomfortable than hearing her roar. Ming held her in his arms, unwilling to let go. She gently pushed him away but to no avail. She placed her hands on his chest and said, "I'm scared. Do you know that?" Ming's heart tightened and he held her more tightly. Yu Lily simply gave up. Her eyes were burning and her vision was blurred. Yu Lily could clearly feel his temperature and breath, but she felt that there was a very, very long ravine between them, deep and dark. As long as she moved forward a little bit, she would fall into it and be smashed into pieces, leaving nothing behind. I'm afraid of your empty promises. Lily's tears flowed down from the corners of her eyes. I don't want to be a mistress anymore, and I don't want to live without dignity by your side. Do you remember that night? Chapter 976. When Lily heard that, she chuckled and said, There is nothing to apologize for. Oh Ming, you should be glad that I didn't succeed in committing suicide. Otherwise, I'm afraid I won't let you go even if I become a ghost. It's impossible. Oh Ming looked at her and his throat tightened. I can't let you die. Lily shook her head, gently pushed his hands away and said, That's it. Let's part on good terms, okay? You have your wife, and I will find a man who loves and dotes on me in the future. I don't have to rely on you, Oh Ming. No. Oh Ming suddenly panicked. In the face of such a Lily, Oh Ming was at a loss. Now Lily. Why not? Lily smiled and there was some pity in her eyes. She looked at Oh Ming in front of her as if she was looking at an ignorant child. Soon she looked away, turned around and said, No one can't live without someone else. As she spoke, she had already walked toward the gate of the community. However, Oh Ming reacted quickly and pulled her back, shouting, I can't. Oh Ming's words made Lily stop. Oh Ming stood behind her looking at her back. His voice was a little empty, hoarse, and with a little bit of imperceptible fear. He said, I can't, Lily. Without you I can't live. When Lily heard that, she laughed out loud. She turned her head and looked at Oh Ming. The compassion in her eyes deepened. She smiled brightly at Oh Ming, as if she was the most brilliant sunflower following the sun, quietly blooming without a sound. Don't deceive yourself, Oh Ming. Lily looked at him and said word by word, You are different from me. You can survive without anyone. It's just that without someone different you will have a different kind of fun. From the beginning, Lily knew very clearly what her identity was, and what kind of identity she should use to exist in front of him. She could provide him for fun, for him to vent his desires, for him to play, but not for him to live. Because the only thing that allowed him to live had always been himself. He was just a clown. No one should take him seriously. In his world, Lily was just playing the role of a clown. She could have remained at his side as long as she wished, as a perceptive mistress, as a clown who knew how to please him. It was just like how the children in the orphanage scolded her when she was young. If she continued to pretend, she would be able to get candy. But she didn't want to, not anymore. It was not interesting at all. When Oh Ming saw her smile, he silently tightened his grip on her hand and said, Wait for me, okay? Wait for me for 2 months. In 2 months I will solve the current problem. When that time comes, marry me. Oh Ming. Lily took his hand away and said, Go back. Your fiancé needs you more than I do. She shook him off and quickly walked back inside. With her back to Oh Ming, her tears fell quietly. Oh Ming looked at her back and felt a little frustrated. Back in the car, Oh Ming took out his phone. She found Shenluo, Anne's number, and dialed it. When Lily came back, her eyes were red. Chapter 977. When Lily saw her, she smiled reluctantly and said, I know what you want to ask. He is my boyfriend. Yi Chanshan was stunned and couldn't believe it. She blurted out, Isn't he getting married? Lily smiled reluctantly and nodded. Yes, he is, but his partner is Shin Manting, Shenluo, Anne's sister, the daughter of the Shin family. Compared with Shin Manting, her identity and background were worlds apart. Lily looked at Yi Chanshan and her eyes became redder. She frowned, but she was still smiling. However, this smile was even uglier than when she was crying, and it was even more unbearable. Yi Chanshan looked at her and swallowed all the words that were on the tip of her tongue. She reached out and gently patted her on the back. What's wrong, Lily? Cry if you are sad. It's better than holding it in your heart. Lily's eyes became redder and tears quickly gathered in her eyes. But soon she wiped her tears and smiled brightly. What do you want to eat? I'll cook. Seeing Lily like this, Yi Chanshan pouted and felt a little uncomfortable. She said, Lily, don't be like this. You make me want to cry. Lily patted her, but she couldn't smile. Her throat was choked and all the tears fell. Yi Chanshan looked at her like this, suddenly opened her mouth and cried out, Lily, if you want to cry, just cry. Why are you like this? I can't help it. Seeing her like this, Lily smiled and pushed her to the sofa. Get out of here. I don't want to see you. You are so useless. Yi Chanshan wiped her tears and said, Don't cry. What do you want to eat? I'll cook for you. I'll cook for you. Is the food you cook edible? Yu Lily wiped her face and looked disgusted. She turned and walked toward the kitchen and said, "Let's eat my best dishes." Yi Qianshan was just saying. How could she cook? If she was asked to cook, she would probably blow up the kitchen in minutes. Yu Lily smiled and turned to take out the ingredients she bought during the morning run in the fridge. Her best dishes were all Oming's favorites. For the rest of the time she was almost like a zombie. Yu Lily worked during the day and painted at night. On weekends she quarreled with Yi Qianshan and went shopping. The days seemed very ordinary. However, Oming was not so relaxed. In the private drug research institute, there was finally a breakthrough. The scientist in charge immediately reported the good news to Oming, who was pleasantly surprised. Half a month passed and the weather was getting colder. Yu Lily went to buy a new set of winter clothes. When it was the winter solstice, she made glutinous rice balls with Yi Qianshan. When Yi Qianshan called Yi Yuyu to come along, Yi Yuyu was already in the capital. The winter solstice was a time for family reunion. As a newly married woman, it was only natural for her to return to the Shin family. However, when she arrived at the airport, Shin Luo, and who was supposed to pick her up, didn't show up. Instead, Shin Jilia came to pick her up. Yi Yuyu was a little disappointed, but it was within her expectations. Chapter 978. A large basin of water splashed out. Shin Jilia instinctively took a step back and pulled Yi Yuyu back. Yi Yuyu looked on helplessly as the water brushed past her. She was still in a state of shock. Looking at the door, old Mrs. Shun was holding a basin of water. She was disappointed to see that the water didn't splash on Yi Yuyu. When Shin Jilia saw old Mrs. Shun, he shouted angrily, "Grandma, didn't you see that we're back? Why did you splash water?" Children don't understand. You have to pour all the bad luck away. If the bad luck enters the door, it won't be so easy to get rid of it, old Mrs. Shun said seriously, but her eyes were fixed on Yi Yuyu. Shin Jilia was not stupid. He immediately knew who old Mrs. Shun was talking about. He turned his head to look at Yi Yuyu and said, "Sister-in-law, don't get me wrong. Grandma is talking about you. But these words are too hurtful." Shin Jilia was embarrassed to say it, but he saw Yi Yuyu smile and echo the old lady, "Yes, it's better to go." Her expression and look were as if she didn't know that the old lady was scolding her for bad luck. When old Mrs. Shun saw this, she sneered, turned around and walked in. She said lazily, "Bad luck is like a bitch. Whether you care about it or not, it still exists. It's really annoying." Shin Jilia was even more embarrassed. He looked at Yi Yuyu and said, "Sister-in-law?" Yi Yuyu still looked the same. She nodded and said with a smile, "I think Grandma is right. Let's go in." When Shin Jilia saw Yi Yuyu's expression, he felt that Grandma was a little too much. However, even Yi Yuyu didn't lose her temper. Shin Jilia couldn't say anything. He helped Yi Yuyu carry the suitcase and walked inside. After Yi Yuyu walked in, she took the suitcase from Shin Jilia's hand and took it to Shin Luo An's room. When she entered, Shin Luo An was sleeping inside. Perhaps he heard the noise and opened his eyes. A pair of sleepy, hazy eyes looked over with an extremely sharp expression. When Yi Yuyu met his gaze, she froze on the spot. Shin Luo An glanced at the suitcase in her hand and looked at her left ring finger. He curled his lips and asked, "Do you like this room very much?" Yi Yuyu opened her mouth, but before she could say anything she heard Shin Luo An say, "I'll give it to you." While speaking, Shin Luo An had already got up, put on his shoes and stood up. Just as he was about to walk away, Yi Yuyu grabbed his hand. He stopped in his tracks and turned his head to look at her. Yi Yuyu's eyes flickered with sadness. "Brother Luo, and we are husband and wife." Shin heard this sentence and smiled. He held her hand and gently pushed it and said, "Luo and I said, you." Jilia Shin looked at her. Shin Luo An reached out and patted the back of her hand. He said softly, "You've already obtained the identity of Mrs. Shun. I've already married you. What else do you want?" Although Shin Luo An was smiling when he said this, his eyes were cold. The coldness pierced deeply into Yi Yuyu's heart. Chapter 979. Yi Yuyu's breathing was disordered. She looked at Shin Luo An, and her heart was indescribably empty. Something seemed to be fermenting quickly, but when Yi Yuyu tried to catch it, it disappeared without a trace. Shin Luo An had a smile on his face. He let go of her hand, gently pushed her away and walked out of the room. The door was closed and there was a slight sound. The spring that had been tightly gripped in her heart suddenly started to spin. Sorrow slowly and recklessly overflowed. What she wanted was not just this, however, there was no going back. Everything could not go back. The phone in her pocket vibrated slightly. Yu listened to the ringtone of the phone and stood in the same place without moving. Li Jinan, who was far away in Kingstown, held the phone that was ringing and felt a little impatient. He had called more than a dozen times in a row, but there was no response at all. Really? What the hell? What was even more strange was that Li Jinan actually had the patience to make this phone call. Li Jinan was a little annoyed, took out a cigarette, lit it and took a long breath. Little uncle, little uncle. A tender voice came in with the unique sweetness of a little girl. Li Jianue ran into Li Jinan's room and shouted, "Little uncle, mom and dad asked you to go outside." Li Jinan saw the lively little girl, put the phone in his pocket, stood up and picked Li Jianue up and said, "Ursu, have you eaten glutinous rice balls?" Yes. Li Jianue was very happy. She hugged Li Jinan's neck and said, "Are we going to the hospital to see great-grandpa? When can great-grandpa come back?" Li Jinan touched the little girl's nose and said, "Soon, when great-grandpa's illness is cured, he can go home." "Then when will great-grandpa's illness be cured?" Li Jianue looked at Li Jinan and was a little puzzled. Mom said that great-grandpa's illness is a heart disease, but this heart disease is not a heart disease. What is it? Is it a heart disease? Li Jinan carried Li Jianue and walked out. He patiently explained, "No, a heart disease is a disease of the mood, not a disease of the heart. For example, Ursu has a favorite toy today, but she accidentally lost it and can't find it. Will Ursu be unhappy?" "That's right." Li Jianue nodded. "This is called mental illness." Li Jianue tilted her head and thought about it. She said, "Then did great-grandfather lose his toy?" Li Jinan smiled. As he spoke, he had already carried Ursu outside. Li Xiqing and Su Qianxi stood together like a pair of lovers, looking at each other and smiling. They had both a son and a daughter. How blissful. Li Jinan was a little envious. He reached out to touch Li Mosen's head and said, "Where is Desu?" Li Mosen looked up at Li Jinan and said, "Desu went to the hospital with Grandpa and Grandma to accompany great-grandpa. Now they are waiting for us to go together and accompany Grandpa for the winter solstice." Although Li Mosen was young, his narration was already well organized. His little brain was very smart. Su Qianxi held his hand and said, "Let's go. Great-grandfather is waiting for us." The family got into the nanny van and the driver Xiao Yang drove. Chapter 980. In particular, he had shot Tang Menjing with his own hands. This was the biggest stone in the old man's heart. There was almost no one left in the Tang family. Although this generation of the Tang family was not on good terms with the Li family, Captain Li had always been a man of his word. He had promised the Tang brothers that he would protect the Tang family, but in the end, when they arrived at the hospital, the whole family had changed their faces, and their faces were full of joy for the festival. Compared to before, the old man had aged a lot. His hair, which was originally gray, was almost completely white, and the wrinkles on his face had deepened and lengthened. His aged face looked even more benevolent than before. Captain Li knew his situation. He looked at his grandchildren and great-grandchildren happily, and his face was full of satisfaction. Li Jianue, Li Jianqian, and Li Mosen were all in the ward, eating glutinous rice balls with small spoons, talking in childish voices and laughing full of energy. Li Beixing, Li Xiqing and Li Jinan were all there, as well as the Li Xiao and Li Xing families. They all celebrated the festival with Captain Li Sun. Although the venue was in the hospital, the winter solstice was still very lively. Captain Li's smile grew wider. He waved at Li Jinan and Li Beixing and shouted, "Jinan, Beixing, come here." Li Jinan sat next to Captain Li. Captain Li reached out and put his hand on Li Jinan's shoulder. He turned his head, looked at Li Beixing and said, "You are all good children. Even when you are busy, remember to find a wife. I am dying. If I can see you bring a wife back to see me before I die, I will be satisfied even if I die." "Grandpa, don't say that." Li Jinan's heart ached. He took the old and withered hand of Captain Li. "Get better soon. I am waiting for you to arrange a wife for me." Li Beixing nodded in agreement and said, "Me too. Look, the wife you got for my second son is so good. Ah, sister-in-law is simply the best woman I've ever seen. When you get better, remember to introduce me to one as well. I want to be even more blessed than my second son." Li Beixing nodded in agreement. Li Xiqing and Su Qianxi looked ahead and did not speak. Captain Li said with a smile, "I know my own body. You don't have to coax me. Finding a wife is the most important thing." Hearing such a topic, Li Mosen jumped out of the chair and said, "Grandpa, I will also find a wife in the future. When I have children, I will ask Grandpa to name my son and daughter." Everyone heard this and couldn't help laughing. Li Jianqian also ran down and said, "Yes, I heard that my name and Ursa's name were both given by great-grandfather." The children all said that it was very nice. The old man waved at them with a smile and said, "Good, good, good. Then you have to grow up quickly and find a wife. When the time comes, great-grandfather will give your children names, okay?" Li Jianyue held the small bowl and skipped over. In a soft voice she shouted, "Great-grandpa, I want one too." The few children surrounded him and spoke one after another. The old man happily responded to them one by one, but it made the eyes of the people behind him turn red. Su Qianxi's heart ached. Holding his arm, her eyes became red. Chapter 981. The old man's mental state was not very good, and he soon became sleepy. After lying down, Li Xiao and his wife first sent all the children back, while Li Xiqing and his brothers continued to stay in the hospital to accompany the old man. Li Jinan was accompanying his grandfather in the hospital. Suddenly his cell phone rang and he immediately turned to look. But when he saw that it was a call from the company, he was a little disappointed. After solving the company's affairs, Li Jinan dialed the phone number again. This time Yu still didn't answer the phone. The phone was placed in the room and it was muted. Yu helped to cook outside, listening to the conversation between old Mrs. Shun and other family members outside. From the small things at home to those fun things, they didn't mention her at all. Yu was a little disappointed. After helping the nanny to prepare the dishes, she took them out and shouted, "Mom, Dad, Grandma, Uncle, Aunt and Brother Luo, and it's time to eat." After that, she turned around and went back to the kitchen to put the dumplings into the pot one by one. When the family was at the table, Mrs. Shen coughed softly and said, "Is there one person missing?" Shenjilia looked at the crowd and finally moved Shen Luo and then said, "Brother, sister-in-law hasn't come yet." Shen Luo and seemed to suddenly understand and shouted, "Yu, let's eat." When Yu heard this shout, she was immediately overjoyed. She turned her head and answered, "Yes. I'm coming." However, she didn't dare to go just like that. After Yu cooked the dumplings, she scooped them up, put them on the table and sat down next to Shen Luo Han. After all the dumplings were divided and placed in front of each of them, Yu began to eat with chopsticks. Old Mrs. Shen didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. She picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. Mrs. Shen looked at Yu and said, "Yu, don't work too hard. Remember to take care of your body so that you can have a good baby. If you can, it's better for you to quit your job and be a full-time wife at home. Luo and is busy with work so you can help him." A smile appeared on Yuyu's face. Just as she was about to speak, she heard Shen Luo and say, "What's the rush?" While eating the dumplings, Shen Luo and said, "If she wants to have a child, she can do so at any time. She's still so young. Let her work hard. Otherwise, she won't be able to go out to work after giving birth." The smile on Yuyu's face froze. With a dry laugh she replied, "Yeah, I think so too." Mrs. Shun looked at Shen Luo and reproachfully and said, "Yu is young but you're already 28 years old. Look at the children of your age. Which one of them isn't married and has children? You're the eldest brother. You should set an example for Jilia." When Shenjilia heard that, he lowered his head and ate his food in silence. He didn't say anything in case he became the target of a mob. Suddenly he saw a piece of chicken wing. He stretched out his chopsticks and picked it up for Shen Manting, who had been sitting quietly at the side. He said, "Eat more." Shen Manting was stunned. She noticed that Yu was looking at her. She lowered her head guiltily and said, "Thank you, brother." Shen Luo and didn't care and continued to eat. Chapter 982. When old Mrs. Shen saw this, she snorted with dissatisfaction and said, "Some people don't eat if they don't want to eat. They eat slowly and are in a daze. How much do they not want to go back to this family?" Yuyu's expression changed and she said, "Grandma, I didn't. Did I say it was you?" Old Mrs. Shen laughed and said, "Why do you have to take it personally? You're being too honest." Yuyu didn't say anything and continued to eat. In this family she shouldn't talk too much. The more she said, the more mistakes she would make. After dinner, Yuyu sat aside and waited for the family to finish eating so that she could help clean up the dishes. However, when Yuyu was ready to do it, her hand was held. Shen Luo and stood aside and took her hand. He squinted and said lazily, "We don't lack a nanny in our family. Just do your job well. Brother Luo, and don't call me that. I'm your husband." Shen Luo An's voice was not low, and the dining room was close to the living room so the people in the living room could hear it clearly. Shen Manting and Shen Jilia were happy to hear it. One was happy that Shenluo and was likely to fall in love with Yi Yuyu, and the other was happy that Yi Yuyu had finally made it. However, old Mrs. Shen was not so happy. She sat on the sofa and said, "What's so good about this woman? She looks so attractive. She's not a member of our family. She's destined to be separated. It's better not to agree to marry her in the first place. She's a fickle woman. It's also the fate of a second marriage. What a sin." At such a distance, old Mrs. Shen's words could easily be heard by Yi Yuyu. Mrs. Shen felt that something was wrong and said, "Mom, Yuyu is listening." Old Mrs. Shen said confidently, "So what? I'm not afraid of her. As for you, I didn't agree to marry this woman, but you insisted. You framed Shenluo, and because he is not your son, right?" Mrs. Shen was even more embarrassed and speechless for a while. She only gave birth to Shenjielia, and Shenluo, Anne's mother, had already gone crazy after giving birth to Shenluo Han. When she was pregnant with the second child, she was lost outside and Shen Manting was called back later. Mrs. Shen was considered a descendant of a prestigious family. It was not very honorable to be a concubine for someone else. Now that old Mrs. Shen had brought it up, she felt a little awkward. Shen Manting and Shenjielia looked at each other and didn't respond. When Yi Yuyu heard the conversation from afar, she began to take notice of it. In this family, Mama Shen was the person who treated her the best, but because of her, old Madam Shen had said such things. Everyone said that she might not be very smart, but sometimes the words that the old lady said were so accurate and direct. Was such an old lady really not smart? Yi Yuyu had her suspicions, but she was secretly delighted to be pulled along by him. Shenluo pulled her into the room and said, "Stay here. Don't take Grandma's words to heart." Was he concerned about her? Yi Yuyu felt a sweetness in her heart. She nodded her head and replied, "Okay." The corners of Shenluo An's mouth twitched when he saw her expression. He let go of her hand and walked out. Chapter 983. What? Shenluo turned his head and looked at her. "You changed your mind quickly." Being teased, Yi Yuyu blushed a little and said, "What are you going to do?" "Sleep in the study." Shenluo An's face didn't change, as if he was talking about something normal. Yi Yuyu's hand holding Shenluo An's sleeve slightly tightened and said, "Aren't we husband and wife? Husband and wife should sleep in the same room." Shenluo smiled and said, "Yes, but I don't want to." Yi Yuyu felt even more uncomfortable. She lowered her head and said, "Mom also wants us to be together. She is not my mother, nor is she your mother. Why do you listen to her so much?" Shenluo took her hand away and said, "Do you wag your tail at someone who is nice to you? Is he scolding me?" Yi Yuyu raised her eyes and looked at Shenluo. Shenluo smiled gently and said, "I'm kidding. Don't be too sensitive. Go to bed early." After saying that, Shenluo went out. Yi Yuyu was left alone in the room, standing in the same place. The sentence sounded in her mind, "I have married you. What else do you want? Really, in addition to the identity of Mrs. Shen, I can't get anything else?" Yi Yuyu stood in the same place and looked at the front where Shenluo left with her eyes down. How sad. Shen Manting accompanied the old lady to watch TV in the living room and then returned to the room. However, as soon as she turned on the light, she saw a dark shadow lying on her bed. Shen Manting was scared. After seeing that it was Shenluo, she didn't relax at all, and the panic in her heart was even worse. Subconsciously, Shen Manting turned around and turned to open the door to go out. However, before she opened the door, she had been dragged by Shenluo and thrown onto the bed. Shen Manting wanted to scream, but her mouth was covered. Shenluo An's face was a little gloomy. Looking at her pair of extremely panicked eyes, there was a kind of indescribable pleasure in his heart. He looked at her and asked, "Are you afraid?" Shen Manting looked at him in horror, but she shook her head against her will. Shenluo smiled and approached and said, "Who do you want to warn, huh?" Looking at his appearance, Shen Manting's heart was even more frightened. Her heart was beating very fast and she couldn't control it. Looking at him like this, Shen Manting's heart was even more frightened, and her heart was beating very fast. Shenluo narrowed his eyes and pressed Shen Manting's writhing body under him. He caressed her body gently with his big hands and said in a low voice, "Tell me, how should I punish you?" Shen Manting's mouth was covered, and she was so frightened that her body trembled slightly. She tried hard to shake her head, and there was a pleading look in her eyes. Shenluo smiled with satisfaction and said, "I'll let you go, but you can't scream. Otherwise you'll be the unlucky one." Shen Manting nodded and Shenluo unloosened his grip. Fresh air rushed in and she gasped for breath. Just as she was about to speak, Shen Luo pressed her head down and pressed his lips firmly against hers. Shen Manting struggled subconsciously, but Shen Luo pressed her down even harder. He was extremely strong, and he had never felt the slightest bit of pity for her. Holding her in his arms, Shen Manting almost convulsed in pain. Chapter 984. Shen Luo smiled with satisfaction, and even his movements gradually became gentle. Shen Manting passively accepted his kiss, and the taboo estrangement in her heart grew larger and larger. At this moment, Shen Manting felt that she was simply a pervert. She actually kissed her own brother? Shen Luo saw through her thoughts and found that she was no longer fighting. He was very satisfied and said, "That's right. Don't try to refuse me. It won't do you any good." Shen Manting's hands were released. She looked down and found that her hands had been squeezed purple. Shen Manting felt wronged, but she couldn't tell anyone. After all, in this family she was just an outsider. Shen Luo saw her wronged look, so he pitifully kissed her on the cheek and said, "Don't provoke me next time. Otherwise, it won't be as simple as today, my sister." "Sister?" Shen Manting trembled and looked at Shen Luo in front of her as if she was looking at a madman. However, Shen Luo got up, tidied up his clothes and then walked toward the door. When he went out again, his clothes were neat and tidy. What happened in Shen Manting's room just now no one found out and no one saw. In this family, there were always some unspeakable secrets in the dark, waiting for people to uncover. Shen Manting was trembling all over. She took out her mobile phone and called the first person in her mind. However, no one answered. The phone kept ringing in Ming's hand. He leaned against the car door and smoked in annoyance. It was already past 9 o'clock in the evening, and Lily still hadn't come back? He impatiently hung up the phone, picked up the phone and called Lily. Lily was having a party with her colleagues when the phone rang. After taking a look and seeing that it was Ming, she turned her head and continued to shout, "Let's forget the right and wrong and let's reminisce the past. It's always fun to go through hardships together." Yi Chanshan was shaking dice with other colleagues, waving her hand domineeringly and shouting, come on, 5 twos, who wants to compete? 6 threes, pick. I want to open it." Yi Chanshan roared. After opening all the bottles, she realized that there were only 5 threes. She was overjoyed and shouted, "Drink, drink, drink. Bottoms up." Lily saw that they were playing dice so happily, so she immediately threw away the microphone and joined them. However, the phone was still ringing non-stop. Ming got into the car, his mind full of annoyance. When it was almost midnight, he saw a taxi stop. The 2 women were hugging each other, reeking of alcohol. When they came back drunk, they were still singing. When Ming saw Lily like that, his face suddenly darkened. His first reaction was to shout, "Why did you only come back now? Where did you go to play?" However, before he could say anything, he swallowed all of his words. When Lily saw Ming, she laughed and said, "Ming, you're here again. Aren't you annoying? I can see you every day. You're like a ghost that won't go away." When Yi Chanshan heard what Lily said, she fixed her gaze on Lily. She snorted and yelled, "Scumbag! You already have a boyfriend, yet you still come to harm my Lily. Bah! Shameless." Chapter 985. Otherwise, Yi Chanshan, who had been scared when she saw him before, wouldn't have the courage to scold him. Unexpectedly hearing this, Lily held Yi Chanshan and shouted at Ming, "I'm not drunk." Yi Chanshan also followed Lily's example and shouted, "I'm not drunk either." The 2 women put their arms around each other's shoulders and laughed out loud. Then they walked inside, stumbling, and it seemed that they were not in a good state. Ming's lips twitched as if he were looking at 2 mentally retarded people. Some men passing by also stared at the 2 of them. Alarm bells rang in Ming's heart and he followed them in. The security guard saw Ming behind them and felt something was wrong, so he asked, "Who are you?" Ming pointed to Lily and said, "I am her boyfriend." "Liar, you have been there all night. Are you going to do something bad?" The security guard looked at Ming suspiciously. Ming was a little helpless and shouted, "You Lily." "What?" Lily shouted drunkenly, "Shut up, you are so annoying." Ming looked at the security guard and said, "You see, she has this reaction when she is drunk. I will send them up and then come down." The security guard looked at him suspiciously, and after confirming that Lily and Yi Chanshan both knew him, he let him in. Yi Chanshan pressed the button for the elevator and walked into the elevator with her arm around Lily's shoulder. The 2 of them stumbled drunkenly together. Ming was afraid that they would fall, so he wanted to carry Yu Lili away, but what about Yi Qianshan? He had to watch them from behind and not let them fall. Finally he followed them up. Ming watched them enter the password and secretly remembered it. Then he saw Yi Qianshan take out the key drunkenly. Ming, why is it so complicated to open the door? Isn't it better to just get a password? But fortunately the two women were drunk and confused, and the man behind them didn't notice. At the same time, Ming was a little angry at the vigilance of the two women. Fortunately it was him who followed them. If it was another man, what would he do? Seeing the two of them fall on the sofa, Ming finally breathed a sigh of relief. He went forward and pulled Yu Lili up. Yu Lili wriggled a little and shouted impatiently, "What are you doing? Don't touch me." Ming pinched her nose and said in a low voice, "How dare you talk to me like that?" Yu Lili opened her eyes in a daze and seemed to see Ming. She sneered and said, "I still want to hit you, pervert." Ming's face darkened. He picked her up and said, "Which is your room?" Yu Lili didn't want him to hold her. She straightened her legs and stretched her arms out. She shouted, "Don't touch me. Don't touch me. You be asterisk. Don't touch me. Go hug another woman, go scumbag ba." Ming's face was gloomy and he bent her legs. Yu Lili screamed drunkenly, but soon she straightened her legs again. Suddenly Yi Qianshan jumped up from the sofa and shouted, "Get up! People who don't want to be slaves." Chapter 986. Ming took a deep breath and directly carried Yu Lili on his shoulder. Yu Lili's body was suspended in the air. She struggled with her hands and feet and shouted, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" Yi Qianshan looked at this side in confusion. After noticing the movement here, Yi Qianshan was a little angry. She put her hands on her hips and shouted, "Who are you? Tell me your name." Ming held Yu Lili in his arms and felt a headache. In the past, Yu Lili would just lie down and sleep after drinking. How could she go crazy when she was drunk? Sure enough, she was influenced by the company she kept. This Yi Qianshan is really, hey. Ming tried not to let her see him. He tried to open a door and walked in. Fortunately, he saw Yu Lili's digital screen the next day. He carried Yu Lili and walked inside. However, Yu Lili suddenly became quiet and said drunkenly, "What are you doing? Why are you walking around in front of me?" Yu Lili's head was behind him. Ming turned around and saw Yi Qianshan at a glance. Yi Qianshan held a basin in her hand and said, "Shoo, don't be afraid. I will help you kill the bad guys." Ming had an ominous premonition in his heart. Sure enough, before he could say anything, he saw a basin of cold water splashed in his direction. "Ah!" Yu Lili screamed and struggled hard. She screamed, "What are you doing? Why did you pour it on me? I am a good person." Ming loosened his hand and put Yu Lili down at once. Ming closed his eyes, wiped his face and opened his eyes to look at Yi Qianshan. But Yi Qianshan snorted and said seriously, "If you don't accompany me to kill the bad guys, then I have to build a new communist society alone." Ming suddenly felt that it was a mistake for him to follow them, a big mistake. These two people are so tough. What kind of danger can they encounter? I am afraid it is others who are in danger. Yu Lili crawled toward Yi Qianshan from the ground and shouted, "Help, I can't swim. I am going to drown." Yi Qianshan looked at Yu Lili, who was crawling on the ground, and said with contempt, "Silly girl, do you think that is really a swimming pool?" Ming face-bombed, but he finally felt a little relieved. At least he knew it wasn't a swimming pool. Unexpectedly, Yi Qianshan stared at Yu Lili for a long time before saying, "That's shallow water. She won't drown." Yu Lili's eyes were wide open. She was a little confused. "Really?" Yi Qianshan nodded with a serious face and said, "It's true. If you don't believe me, stand up and take a look." Yu Lili stupidly stood up with a look of surprise. "It's true." Ming couldn't stand it anymore. Such a brainless conversation was simply irritating to the ears. He walked up to Yi Qianshan and pushed her out. He locked the door from the inside. Yi Qianshan slammed on the door and shouted, "What are you doing? Why are you chasing me away?" Ming felt like he was about to collapse. He shouted toward the outside, "There are explosives inside. It's dangerous. Report the situation here to the organization. The future of the country depends on you, comrade." When Yi Qianshan heard it, she immediately became serious and shouted, "Yes, sir." Ming breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, she drove him away. He turned around and saw Yu Lili, who had been splashed with water by Yi Qianshan. He sighed and turned over her pajamas. When he was about to pull her up, He found that Yu Lily was staring at him with her eyes open. Ming's heart skipped a beat. He thought she was sober, but then Yu Lily said, "Comrade, where is the bomb hidden?" Chapter 987. Ming was speechless. He picked her up and patted her on the butt. "Shut up. The bomb has been solved. The organization asked me to help you put on the bulletproof vest." "Oh." Yu Lily covered her chest with her hands and looked at Ming in front of her with a dangerous expression. Ming was going crazy. He took a deep breath and asked, "Why?" Yu Lily heard this question and was a little stunned. "What?" Covering her chest, Yu Lily thought for a moment and said in a daze, "Because Ming will be angry." Ming's heart warmed when he heard that. Looking at her silly look, he asked in a low voice, "Who is Ming?" "Ming is AB *T," Yu Lily said confidently. Ming's original expectations were all gone. He lifted her up and said, "Behave." "No, no, no." Yu Lily's mouth was dry and she was about to cry. Ming will be angry. Is Ming so terrible when he is angry? Is he scared to cry? Ming felt a little funny and asked, "What will happen when Ming is angry?" "I'll scold you and I'll step on you. It hurts, it hurts." Yu Lily burst into tears. "It really hurts." Shenluo, and said. Ming suddenly felt that he didn't quite understand what she was saying. He didn't deny cursing, but when did he step on her? But Ming was a little helpless and said, "Be good. Your clothes are wet. I will change them for you." "No, I am Ming." Ming sighed and said helplessly, "So, Ming will not be angry, will not curse you, and will not step on you. Be good, change your wet clothes and then go to sleep, okay?" "Really?" Yu Lily stopped crying and looked at Ming blankly. Looking at his face for a long time, she asked again, "Really?" Ming nodded with certainty and said, "Yes, it's true. It can't be wrong." With that, Ming reached out to lift her clothes and coaxed her in a coaxing tone. "Come on, put on the bulletproof vest." "Oh." Then Yu Lily really didn't move and let Ming change her clothes for her. After changing, Yu Lily's eyes were closed and her breathing was even. She had fallen asleep. Ming felt a little helpless and gently put her on the bed. After covering her with the blanket, he planted a gentle kiss on her lips. Then he stood up and walked out. There was still a comrade outside who had gone to report to the organization. If he got lost, it would be a grave sin. When he walked out, he saw that half of Yi Chanshan's body was hidden under the dining table, and the other half was exposed. She was holding the basin of water that she had just splashed. Her face was up and her mouth was slightly open. She was snoring softly. She was fast asleep. He could not bear to look at it. Ming covered his eyes, took a blanket from the sofa and covered her with it. Then he walked back into Yu Lily's room. Yi Chanshan was awakened by the cold. He opened his eyes and realized that he was lying on the floor like a lunatic. He got up abruptly, but his forehead hit the leg of the dining table. "Dong." Yi Chanshan covered her forehead and wailed. "Oh my God. Do you have to do this?" At the same time, Yu Lily walked out of the room and rubbed her eyes. Yi Chanshan felt a splitting headache. Why was she sleeping on the floor? Sleeping on the floor was one thing, but why was there a basin of water next to her? Chapter 988. Yi Chanshan wanted to cry. She got up with the help of the table leg and said, "How did we come back last night?" Yu Lily was a little confused and said blankly, "Did we come back by taxi? Then why are we different?" Yi Chanshan was cold. Looking at Yu Lily's pajamas, she rubbed her arms and jumped. "I slept on the floor and you slept on the bed. What? Why didn't you wake me up? It's so cold on the floor." Yu Lily was also a little confused. She frowned and shook her head. "I don't know. I forgot. I have a headache." "I also have a headache." Yi Chanshan also looked painful and said, "Forget it. I'm going to take a bath to warm myself. I'm freezing." Yi Chanshan took her pajamas and took a bath. Yu Lily went to the kitchen to make 2 glasses of honey water. She drank one and put the other on the table. She shouted, "Chanshan, there is honey water outside. Remember to drink it." "Okay." Yi Chanshan responded while taking a bath. Then Yu Lily finished drinking and went back to the room. But inadvertently she saw a dry water stain on the ground, and there was a footprint on it. The footprint was very big. Yu Lily compared it and was sure that it was a man's foot. But who could it be? Yu Lily subconsciously thought of Ming's face. "Last night? I seem to have seen him. Is it him? After carrying me back he changed my clothes. Then he just left Yi Chanshan alone?" The more Yu Lily thought about it, the more likely it was. "Damn it. I can't remember." Yu Lily knocked her head and fell on the bed like a corpse. When Yi Qianshan came out of the bath, the honey water was still warm. She walked to Yu Lily's room with a headache. At a glance, she saw Yu Lily lying on the bed, gradually falling asleep, but her hands were covering her face. It seemed that she wanted to block the light. Yi Qianshan felt a little funny when she saw Yu Lily like this. She picked up her mobile phone and took a selfie of herself and the honey water in her hand. Standing in front of Yu Lily's table, she clearly took the picture. After taking the picture, Yi Qianshan posted it on WeChat Moments and edited. The flower of the editorial department covers her face to sleep because she can't see anyone without makeup. As soon as it was posted, many people commented, "Ha ha." There were quite a number of people who liked the post. When Yi Qianshan saw the comments below, she was in a good mood and laughed out loud. Yi Qianshan clicked on the notifications one by one. Suddenly she saw a cute cartoon pig head. It was Shanyu. Shanyu liked it. When Yi Qianshan saw Shanyu, she subconsciously thought of all the unfriendliness Shanyu had shown her during this period of time. This unfriendliness was fine when it came to Yu Lily, but when it came to Yi Qianshan, Yu Lily almost couldn't help but want to punch her. If Yi Qianshan hadn't stopped her, she had no doubt that Yu Lily would have taught Shanyu a lesson. At the very least, Shanyu was no match for Yu Lily when it came to fighting. Yi Qianshan didn't care about it, but she soon saw Shanyu's comment. The digital screen at the back looks so familiar. Yi Qianshan didn't know if it was an illusion, but she inexplicably felt that Shanyu's words had a hidden meaning. Chapter 989. When Yi Qianshan returned to her room, she picked up her phone and scrolled through her WeChat moments. She immediately saw Yi Yuyu's selfie. In the selfie, Yi Yuyu's long hair draped over her shoulders, revealing her fair and delicate side profile. She was smiling, and behind her was a retro telephone. It should be something from the Shen family. There were words on it: "Contentment brings happiness." Yi Qianshan's heart ached when she saw those words. Yi Qianshan felt both sympathy and envy for her younger sister, whom she had been separated from at a young age. Yi Qianshan sympathized with Yi Qianshan's unhappiness in her family, but at the same time she envied Yi Qianshan's wealth in her family. She also envied Yi Qianshan's horizons and social circle. Yi Qianshan followed her mother, and her stepfather was an honest working-class man. Yi Qianshan liked Yi Yuyu's post and sent a smiley face. When Yi Yuyu saw Yi Qianshan's message, she smiled and quickly put her phone away. Shen Luo and was busy with work. After the winter solstice, he continued to be busy. Everyone in the family was busy. Shen Jiliya and Shen Manting were going to Kingstown together. Coincidentally, Yi Yuyu had a schedule in Kingstown, so they agreed to go together. However, to everyone's surprise, old Mrs. Shen refused to let Yi Yuyu leave. She insisted that she stay one more day. Yi Yuyu had no choice but to stay for another day and let Shen Jiliya and Shen Manting leave first. After Shen Jiliya and Shen Manting left, old Mrs. Shen said, "I want to go to Kingstown too." Seeing Yi Yuyu's surprise, old Mrs. Shen sneered with dissatisfaction and said in a somewhat bitter tone, "What? You're an actress and you're afraid of bringing an old woman like me with you? Are you afraid of losing face?" When Yi Yuyu heard that, her heart skipped a beat. She quickly waved her hands and explained, "There's no such thing, Grandma. How would I dare to do that? It's just that it will take a long time to get to Kingstown. If we take a plane, I'm afraid. I took the high-speed train the last time. This time, let's take the high-speed train together." Old Mrs. Shen glanced at Yi Yuyu, but her expression remained haughty. Seeing the embarrassment on Yi Yuyu's face, old Mrs. Shen said with a straight face, "You don't want to? Just now little uncle and little aunt were together, why didn't you? It's impossible for them to bring me there. If Long Yu finds out, they will definitely be scolded." Yi Yuyu was speechless. She would be scolded too. Moreover, because she was an outsider, she would be scolded even more harshly. Old Mrs. Shen seemed to know what she was thinking, but she didn't care. She looked at her arrogantly and said, "You don't want to? Yesterday you said that you would be filial to him, but now I've forgotten about it. How hypocritical." Yi Yuyu felt that it was inappropriate and said, "Grandma, do you want to tell Mom and Dad? I think you just can't wait to take me along. If I tell them, will they let me out?" Old Mrs. Shen was furious. She stood up from the sofa and said angrily, "Forget it. I'll go by myself. You just want me to go out and get killed, don't you? I've seen through you a long time ago." Yi Yuyu couldn't bear to hear that. She pulled the old lady and said, "Grandma, I'll take you there." Old Mrs. Shen had expected this. She snorted and said, "Help me pack my things. We'll leave in the afternoon." Chapter 990. The old lady was the one in charge of the family. No matter what the Shen family wanted to do, as long as they didn't get the approval of the old lady, they couldn't do it. Except Shen Luo, Anne's marriage to her. However, there was nothing between her and Shen Luo, and except a marriage certificate and a ring. There was no wedding photos, and no sex between husband and wife. Everything seemed like it was just a make-do. Only she was trying her best to cater to him. If you love him, you have to cater to everything about him, right? The weekend passed quickly. After Yu Lily handed over the 5th episode of Love Transaction on Sunday night, the dramatic reversal of the plot caused a lot of controversy. Also because of Love Transaction, the number of downloads of the Eurasian Comics app increased, and the number of downloads was in the tens of thousands. Yi Chanchan's performance skyrocketed, and she became the queen of performance that many people in the editorial department envied. Monday. It was rare that Yi Chanchan didn't ride the bike. She was a little excited and walked with Yu Lily. Yu Lily chatted with Yi Chanchan all the way to the company. After they said hello, they saw the surrounding colleagues pointing at them and whispering to each other. Yi Chanchan sat in her seat, but as soon as she sat down, she heard her boss, Editor-in-Chief Zhou, shouting, "Yi Chanchan, come to my office." Editor-in-Chief Zhou rarely talked to Yi Chanchan. This old woman was a little cold. Recently, except for some boys in the technical department and Yu Lily, Editor-in-Chief Zhou rarely talked to anyone. It was the first time that she directly called out Yi Chanchan for trouble like today. Everyone's eyes fell on Yi Chanchan and they whispered. Yi Chanchan had no idea what was going on, and so did Yu Lily. Seeing Yi Chanchan being called into the office, Yu Lily looked around. She found that everyone's eyes were strange except for Shan Yu. She sat next to Yi Chanchan with a calm face and was picking up a stack of contracts. Shan Yu had been targeting her and Yi Chanchan more than once or twice recently. Seeing Shan Yu's appearance, Yu Lily was sure that this matter must have something to do with her. Yu Lily stood up and didn't directly ask Shan Yu. Instead, she asked a colleague next to her, "What's the matter? Why is everyone acting so weird today?" The colleague looked at Yu Lily with a strange expression and asked, "Are you living with Yi Chanchan?" "Yeah, what's wrong?" The colleague's expression became even weirder. "We suspect that she pocketed the gift that was supposed to be given to the painter. It's worth a lot. Chief Editor Zhou may be checking with her now." When Yu Lily heard that, she frowned and blurted out, "How is that possible? If Yi Chanchan would do something like that, how could I not know?" "There is only one truth," Shan Yu suddenly said. She stood up and looked at Yu Lily. "You two are in cahoots. Of course you have to pretend to be stupid. Otherwise, how could you not know such a big thing was placed there?" Yu Lily was annoyed to see Shan Yu like this. She snorted and asked, "What did Yi Chanchan take away? Is it expensive? How much?" Chapter 991. Shan Yu looked at Yu Lily with a distressed look and said, "I didn't expect you to be such a person. You are in cahoots with each other." When Yu Lily heard that, she laughed and said, "How did you know? See, you admit it?" Shan Yu looked at her with a disappointed look and said, "Last time I saw the chat window between you and Yi Chanchan. I clearly saw that you were chatting and you were talking about gifts." Yu Lily heard this and subconsciously looked back, but she couldn't remember. After all, it had been a long time. However, hearing such words, Yu Lily shook her head and said, "Your glasses are so old. How can you see those things so clearly?" As she spoke, Yu Lily reached out to Shan Yu's eyes. Shan Yu's face changed. She reflexively reached out and patted Yu Lily's hand, shouting, "Yu Lily, don't go too far." Yu Lily's face also darkened. She sneered, looked at her angrily and said sarcastically, "I just want to see if your thick glasses are as ugly as you look." The merciless sarcasm made Shan Yu's face suddenly distorted. She gritted her teeth and shouted, "Shut up." "What's the saying?" Yu Lily deliberately tilted her head and thought for a moment, then said, Ugly people make more trouble. It probably means you, right?" Not being good-looking had always been the biggest pain in Shan Yu's heart. Usually, people around her knew that she was sensitive, so they rarely used such an obvious weakness to satirize her. Hearing Yu Lily's words, Shan Yu's eyes were red with anger. She flew into a rage and shouted, "Don't go too far. So what if you are good-looking? You are still a thief. You don't know how to dispose of the stolen goods. You were caught by others, but you still have such an attitude. You are shameless." Yu Lily heard this and smiled proudly. She raised her eyebrows and said, "There are many benefits to being good-looking. For example, people will not say that ugly people make more trouble." Shan Yu was even more angry and shouted, "You thief, how dare you quibble?" "When did I quibble?" Yu Lily retorted. "Do you know what quibbling means?" You don't know what it means, yet you're still using random words. Didn't your language teacher die early? If he knew that you were using words so carelessly, wouldn't he be so angry that he wouldn't rest in peace? Shanyu was at a loss for words. She stared at Yu Lily with her red eyes and paused for a moment before saying, "So, you admit it?" What did he admit? Yu Lily looked at her hopeless expression and laughed proudly. "You're so stupid. Don't try to frame others. Yes, the digital screen is indeed in our possession." Yu Lily looked at Yi Qianqian with a smile. See. Shanyu was overjoyed. She looked around at her colleagues and said, "Admit it." The surrounding colleagues all looked at each other and said one after another, "It can't be. I can't believe Yi Qianqian would do such a thing. She relied on Li Xiaoyu to get to where she is today. She even swallowed Li Xiaoyu's digital screen. How terrifying. Sigh, looks like we won't be able to be kind this time." Chapter 992. Did you steal it? Shanyu looked at Yu Lily incredulously. But in her heart she was even more proud. Originally she just wanted Yi Qianqian to pay a little price, but she didn't expect that Yu Lily would be directly exposed. If this matter were to be carried out, then Yu Lily would definitely not be able to get the promotion that she originally had. Moreover, Yu Lily was still a newcomer. Maybe she would be fired directly. Shanyu was a little excited in her heart, but she still pretended to be calm and looked at Yu Lily in front of her. Yu Lily snorted and said, "The company gave it to me, so of course it is mine." You. Shanyu heard that and laughed. "This is for Li Xiaoyu, right? Are you Li Xiaoyu?" "Yes, I'm Li Xiaoyu," Yu Lily said calmly. But, let alone Shanyu, even other colleagues didn't believe it. Shanyu laughed and said, "Do you think I'm a 3-year-old child? If you are really Li Xiaoyu, then you are as arrogant as the people above you." Yu Lily heard Shanyu's words, also laughed and said, "Do you think you know me very well? Idiot. I'm not a fairy that an ugly person like you can see through." Shanyu's face turned greener and she roared, "Yu Lily, you are shameless. I'm not like you. How can I not have such a beautiful face? What are you arguing about?" The voice of Editor-in-Chief Zhou came out at the same time as Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian walked toward Yu Lily, but she stared straight at Shanyu and said, "What hatred do I have for you? Why do you frame me like this?" Editor-in-Chief Zhou came over, looked at Shanyu and said, "I have asked about the matter. The digital screen has indeed been sent out." Shanyu was stunned and said, "What's going on? Is it? Yu Lily, are you Li Xiaoyu?" Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at Yu Lily with surprise in her eyes. "Love transaction was drawn by you?" "Yes." Yu Lily smiled brightly and nodded. "It turns out that you didn't know. I thought you could see it backstage." Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at Yu Lily for a long time, shook her head, laughed and said, "I didn't expect you to be so powerful. When Yi Qianqian told me just now, I didn't believe her. I did a background check and even matched her ID number. So I didn't expect that." Editor-in-Chief Zhou's words stunned everyone around her. Shan Yu's expression suddenly became interesting. Looking at Yu Lily and Yi Qianqian, she seemed a little embarrassed. She looked at Yu Lily and said, "You are Li Xiaoyu? How could that be?" Yi Qianqian had never been cold to anyone, but this time she couldn't help it. She looked at Shanyu with a sullen face and said, "I'm not like you. You are useless all day long and full of bad ideas. You actually want to frame me? F***CK, I'm not bad to you, right? Why do you have to do this?" Shanyu's face turned even paler. She looked at Yi Qianqian and shouted, "Qianqian, Editor-in-Chief Zhou, I don't need her to be my assistant anymore. Shanyu is absent-minded during work every day. There have been several contract problems and I have to solve them myself. She is not serious and responsible and she is forgetful. She is so annoying. Dash. Chapter 993. Shanyu's face finally changed. She shouted, "Qianqian, I didn't do that. Don't frame me. You know in your heart whether I did it or not. I've had enough of it. I'm your boss but you give me a cold shoulder every day. Editor-in-Chief Zhou, you do as you see fit. Anyway, I don't want her to be my assistant. It's boring. It's as if everything she does is my fault. So, you're blaming me for being ugly and useless?" Every word that Yi Qianqian said was very hurtful. Yu Lily raised her eyebrows and looked at Yi Qianqian. They saw a tacit understanding in each other's eyes. It was easy to pick up each other's habits after spending a long time with each other. If it had been before, Yi Qianqian would never have said such a thing. Now that she had said it, she didn't feel guilty at all. Shanyu was speechless. Editor-in-Chief Zhou looked at Shanyu and said, "Shanyu, come in with me." Editor-in-Chief Zhou took the lead and walked into the office. Shan Yu stood in the same place. After looking at Yi Qianqian and Yu Lili, she followed Editor-in-Chief Zhou into the office. As soon as Shan Yu and Editor-in-Chief Zhou left, they all came to Yu Lili incredulously and asked, "Lili, so you are Li Xiaoyu? Oh my god, the goddess was hiding around us. None of us found out. You are so low-key." Yu Lili felt their incredible eyes. She smiled unconsciously and said, "It's okay. I'm just afraid that if I say it, I will face your eyes of worship. It will be very stressful." When everyone heard this, they rolled their eyes and quickly dispersed. Yu Lili looked very frustrated and said, "Don't do this. Don't leave me alone." However, no one paid attention to her. It was no different from usual. Yu Lili looked disappointed, but in her heart, she breathed a sigh of relief. Yu Lili continued to work. She was still doing the same work as usual, but today seemed to be destined to be a little different. Shan Yu stayed in Editor-in-Chief Zhou's office for a long time before she came out. Her eyes were red and she stared at Yu Lili with jealousy. Then Yu Lili was also called in. Editor-in-Chief Zhou sat in front of the computer, looked at Yu Lili and said, "Shan Yu is still not suitable here. I learned that she is not very popular and forgetful. So I transferred her to the front desk. Now there is only one person who can be promoted to the position of editor, and it can only be you." Yu Lili had expected it, but she still couldn't help but be surprised. Her eyes lit up, and she looked at Editor-in-Chief Zhou in front of her and shouted, "Really? Well, let's not talk about your identity as Li Xiaoyu first. You're very capable in all aspects. Of course this position is yours. Good luck." More importantly, Editor-in-Chief Zhou had once faced the crisis of being fired, and it was Yu Lili who helped her stay. Yu Lili should be promoted regardless of whether it was for the public or for personal reasons. Yu Lili cheered and shouted, "Thank you, Chief Editor Zhou." Editor-in-Chief Zhou nodded and said, "Go to work. Ask Yi Qianqian to take you." "All right." Yu Lili walked out and quickly entered a new state of work. Chapter 994. Yu Lili followed Yi Qianqian to learn the precautions for her new position and some routine operations. They spent the whole morning learning. After lunch, Yu Lili and Yi Qianqian were about to go back to the company when they received a phone call. She was in the capital. Yu Lili didn't need to pick up the phone, but she had already guessed who it was. It was none other than the Shin family. Unfortunately, Yu Lili didn't have a good impression of the Shin family at all. Because of Shin Manting, Shin Luo, and also because of Shin Longyue's disdain and shock after hearing her identity. The only person who left a good impression on her was the old lady of the Shin family. Fortunately, it was all good news. Yu Lili couldn't help but feel a lot more relaxed. But the phone kept calling, and Yu Lili set the phone to silent mode. When she returned to the company, Yu Lili picked up the phone and found that there were more than a dozen missed calls and several text messages. She picked up the phone and clicked on the text messages. There were several in a row. "I came to Kingstown to find you. Where are you? I am the old lady of the Shin family. You saved me. Thank you very much for that day. Miss, answer the phone." Just as Yu Lili finished reading these text messages, another phone call came in. Yu Lili picked up the phone this time, and there was an old voice coming from the other side. "Hello, is that you, miss?" "It's me." Yu Lili felt a little strange. Listening to the voice on the other side, that tone didn't seem to be talking to an outsider. When old Mrs. Shin heard Yu Lili's answer, she was a little relieved and happy. She said, "You finally answered the phone. Where are you? I'll go to play with you, okay?" "Well, Grandma, why are you in Kingstown again? Didn't you go back to the capital? Did you come all the way here to find your grandson?" "No, I'm here to look for you." "What's so fun about looking for grandchildren? They're not filial at all. You're the best." Old Madam Shin's aged voice sounded. She sighed. "If an old woman like me were to be seen by my grandchildren on the streets, they would definitely ignore me. But you saved me. I can tell that you are my fated person. To be honest, there is an evil aura in my life. When I looked at your physiognomy and palmistry, I realized that you and I complement each other. Miss, you can help me resolve that evil aura. Also, I can help you solve some problems that you can't solve." Yu Lili was a little mystified. Such a thing was really amazing. Yu Lili believed some of it but not all of it. Hearing the old lady's words, Yu Lili suddenly felt that something was wrong. Could this old woman be a swindler? However, since she was Shin Manting's grandmother, it shouldn't be possible. When old Mrs. Shin heard that Yu Lili was silent, she asked, "Where are you?" I'm working in the company." "I see. I'm alone at the station now. I don't know how to get there." Can you tell me the address? Well? Yu Lily felt a little embarrassed and said, why don't you call someone to pick you up? Call Shin Manting or Shin Jilia. Chapter 995. Let O Ming pick her up? When Yu Lily heard this, she immediately thought of the relationship between her and O Ming. Although Shin Manting and O Ming were not married yet, both parents should have met each other. O Ming was also her future grandson-in-law. After Yu Lily asked her for the address, she called O Ming. O Ming was in a meeting and everyone in the meeting room was a little anxious because the mealtime was delayed. However, without O Ming's permission no one could leave. Therefore, it dragged on like this and no one was able to suggest that they should leave first. What everyone didn't expect was that O Ming, who seemed to be in a bad mood just now, immediately stopped talking after seeing a phone call. Everyone stared at O Ming and no one dared to speak. O Ming picked up the phone as if there was no one else around and waited for the other side to speak first. O Ming? Yes. Yu Lily thought about her words and said, Shin Manting's grandmother is in the station. Now she is waiting for someone to pick her up. You go pick her up. I have to go to work and have no time to go. Shin Manting's grandmother? O Ming felt a little surprised. How do you know? Since it was Shin Manting's grandmother, why did she come to Yu Lily? She called me. O Ming felt even more strange. The old lady of the Shin family had a very strange temper. She treated many people with an aloof look, and her mouth was full of the book of changes. She was a liar. Every time she saw him she would praise him, unspeakably noble, unspeakably noble. However, apart from this sentence there was nothing else. Now she came to Kingstown to find Yu Lily instead of Shin Manting or Shin Jilia? What? O Ming asked subconsciously. Such a thing was too strange. Yu Lily felt a little helpless. How would I know? Anyway, she asked you to pick her up. I have already told her. It is your business whether you pick her up or not. After that, Yu Lily hung up the phone directly. O Ming listened to the busy tone coming from the phone and looked up. The whole meeting room was staring at him. O Ming's face was still calm and he said calmly, where were we? Old Mrs. Shin knew that O Ming would never come to pick her up. Sitting on a bench at the bus stop, old Mrs. Shin took out her cell phone and called Yu Lily again. Yu watched her from the side. She felt that when the old lady faced others she was completely different from when she faced her. Old Mrs. Han was aloof and virtuous toward strangers and treated her own family with respect. She had a proud attitude toward many people, but when it came to Yu, her face was full of disgust. She didn't even try to hide her unruly attitude. Could it really be because of the so-called confirmation of fate? Just as she was deep in thought, she felt a gentle pat on her shoulder. Yu was shocked and turned her head to look. His gaze collided with a pair of chilly and aloof eyes that were like the cool breeze and clear moon in a midsummer night. Just a glance was enough to make one forget to leave. When she saw who he was, she turned pale with fright. She immediately turned her head around and pretended not to know him. That's right, Li Jinan said. Chapter 996. Yu almost blurted out the words, which made her feel even more wonderful. Li Jinan heard the old lady's straightforward praise, grinned and nodded politely. Hello. Yu stood up and said to the old lady, Grandma, let me take you there. It's faster. Old Mrs. Shun was a little unhappy when she heard this. She turned her head and glared at Yu saying, What? Are you impatient? Well, a few days ago you wanted to be filial to me. Now you're like this. You're so hypocritical. Yu was used to the old lady's tone, but today she said it in front of Li Jinan, which made Yu feel more embarrassed than ever. How could she? Yu's face was burning and she explained, No, Grandma, you misunderstood me. I think you just want to get rid of me quickly and then do your own things, right? I knew that you were already holding a grudge when I asked you to stay at home for one more day yesterday. Old Mrs. Shin's tone was a little bitter. When she spoke, she stared at Yu with some resentment. No, who is this? Old Mrs. Shin interrupted Yu and pointed to Li Jinan. Hello, my name is Li Jinan. Li Jinan smiled and looked at the old lady. What's your relationship? Old Mrs. Shin's eyes were full of shrewdness. She looked at Li Jinan and then at Yu and snorted. Yu felt a little nervous. Inexplicably, Yu was a little afraid of this old lady. Although she liked to spout nonsense most of the time, people had no choice but to believe what she said. Moreover, she often said that she could tell something from a person's face. At this moment, Yu's heart couldn't help but beat faster. Will she find out that I and Li Jinan? It's over, it's a mess. Yu hurriedly said, Grandma, he is my boss. So that's how it is. I said that you can't hook such a good guy with such a bad life. As she said that, she looked at Li Jinan with a smile and said, Brother Li, right? Oh, you look really good. Can I see your hand? Li Jinan nodded. Li Jinan was baffled. He had never encountered such a situation before. Seeing old Mrs. Shen's radiant smile, Li Jinan glanced at Yi Yuyu with a smile and extended his left hand. Old Mrs. Shen's eyes lit up when she saw his hand. Holding it with both hands, he looked at it carefully and said, What a good broken palm. If you were born in ancient times, you would be either an emperor or a prince. You would be rich and powerful all your life. It's a pity that it was broken at the peak of your life. Did you give up on a particularly good future? Li Jinan withdrew his hand, feeling a little creeped out by the old lady's words. He used to be a major in the military but later retired. He was almost beaten to death by Li Xiao. But how did this old lady know? How mysterious. Li Jinan cleared his throat and asked, Grandma, how did you know? I am a half-immortal, there is nothing that I do not know. Old Mrs. Shen was a little proud. Suddenly she saw a figure in the distance. Old Mrs. Shen was a little excited and shouted, Miss, I'm here. Yu Lily saw old Mrs. Shen with Yi Yuyu and Li Jinan by her side. She was shocked but she still walked over. Chapter 997. Old Mrs. Shen was a little happy to see Yu Lily. She took her hand and turned to look at Li Jinan. What do you think of this young man? While talking, she leaned over to Yu Lily and said, This young man is good. He is much better than O Ming. Yu Lily turned her head and looked at old Mrs. Shen strangely. Does this old lady want to introduce me to a boyfriend? She even compared O Ming with Li Jinan? Yu Lily felt a little embarrassed. Why is this old lady so friendly? As far as I know, the Shen family and the Li family should have no relationship. Old Mrs. Shen made Yu Lily feel a little embarrassed on the spot. She smiled, looked at Li Jinan and said, Third Master Li, why are you here? I was passing by and happened to see Miss Yi, so I came to say hello. Do you know this old lady? Of course I know her. Before Yu Lily could speak, the old lady spoke first and said, This girl is my destined person. She saved my life. Yu Lily was even more embarrassed. Looking at her arm being held by old Mrs. Shen, she said, Why did you come here by yourself? I'd better call your grandson or granddaughter. I didn't save their numbers. You can call them. Yu Lily had the habit of cleaning up records. Sometimes when she was bored, she would clear the records. Therefore she didn't save their numbers at all. Otherwise, Yu Lily wouldn't have come alone because she was worried about the old lady. Yi Yuyu saw the intimate look of old Mrs. Shen holding Yu Lily's arm and felt a little strange. It turned out that old Mrs. Shen, who had always been mean in front of her, had such a side. It seemed that old Mrs. Shen wanted to stick to this girl. Old Mrs. Shen wouldn't treat anyone like this. At the same time, Yi Yuyu also felt a little uncomfortable. She said hello to Yu Lily and said, Hello, we meet again. Yu Lily naturally recognized that this was Yi Qianshan's sister. She nodded with a smile and said, You and this old lady? I don't know her. I'm just passing by. Old Mrs. Shen pushed her gently, then reached out to pull the luggage and said, Let's go. Where are you going? Yu Lily looked at the old lady and felt a little distressed. I don't know where your grandson is. But soon she thought of something and sent a message to O Ming, Give me Shin Manting's number. O Ming had just finished a meeting and sat alone in the conference room. After looking at it, he called Yu Lily. Yu Lily quickly picked up. O Ming was inexplicably relieved and asked, Shin Manting is Shun. Grandma is at the station. You can ask her to pick you up. No, don't let them come over. Old Mrs. Shen snatched the phone from Yu Lily's hand and hung up. She said pitifully, They abuse the elderly. I have no choice but to come to you. Young lady, I beg you. Don't call them over, okay? Yu Lily's eyes widened. You and Yu and Wang. You and you Mrs. Yu Lily thought. You and Li. Mrs. Yu Mrs. with you. Chapter 998. Yi Yuyu's words were intended to help Yu Lily and the old lady out of the situation. Yu Lily suddenly remembered what their relationship was. It seemed that Shen Luo and was the grandson of old Mrs. Shen, and Yi Yuyu was his wife. After sorting out their relationship, Yu Lily felt that their family was really chaotic. Yu Lily didn't want to get involved in this mess, so she nodded in response to Yi Yuyu's words. However, old Mrs. Shen's skin was much thicker than Yu Lily had imagined. Old Mrs. Shen stared at her and said, What do you mean? The fate between me and Lily is not something that an ordinary person like you can see. Don't try to sow discord between us. The little girl likes me very much. How can she feel troubled? Right, girl? There was a very obvious expectation on old Mrs. Shin's face. A pair of slightly turbid eyes seemed to shine as she looked at Lily. Lily immediately felt that she was being relied on. Suddenly she felt a headache coming on. She was a little embarrassed and helpless. She looked at the old woman who was full of anticipation and said, "Grandma, you'd better go with your granddaughter-in-law. I'm still at work. I thought you were here alone. If I had known that Miss Yi was here, I wouldn't have come. I'm a little busy over there. It's okay. You take me to your company. You do your work. I won't make any trouble." Old Mrs. Shun looked at Lily with an expression that said, "I'm the most honest and obedient." She nodded her head vigorously to show that she was being honest. Yu saw that Lily didn't want to take the old lady with her, so she was also embarrassed. She pulled old Mrs. Shun and said, "Grandma, I'll take you to my place first. After this lady gets off work, I'll take you to see her. Is that okay?" Lily took advantage of the situation and said, "Yes, I'm very busy. If I don't do my work well, I will be fired." As she said that, she looked distressed and full of helplessness. When old Mrs. Shin saw Lily's expression, she also realized that she seemed to be a little too capricious. After thinking for a while, she said, "Well, you do your work first. Don't leave me behind, okay?" Leave? For an old man to say such a thing to her, it was as if Lily had done something heinous. At the same time, he was filled with regret. If he had known this would happen, he wouldn't have come. Now this old lady clearly wanted to rely on him. "What should I do?" Yu looked at Lily and said, "In that case, can you accompany my grandmother to find a hotel? Please." Facing Yu's gaze and the old lady's, Lily couldn't help but nod her head. Li Jinan looked at his watch and said, "My time is almost up. You go find a hotel first. I'll go first." "Alright, go ahead." Old Mrs. Shun looked at Li Jinan with a smile. She then looked at Yu and asked, "Do you have his number?" Yu felt a little guilty. Did the old madam notice something? She hesitated for a moment before nodding her head. "Yes. That's good. Young man, go ahead." Li Jinan nodded politely and turned to leave. Old Mrs. Shun turned around, took out her mobile phone and said, "Give me the phone number of that young man." Lily. Chapter 999. Yu was embarrassed. Under Lily's strange gaze, her face was a little hot. What does the old lady want to do? Is it really because he is handsome and then can't help it? Does she want to flirt with a man? But Li Jinan is less than 30 years old, and he is almost the same age as Shinluo An. Is this not good? However, the other party is Shinluo An's most respected grandmother. Yu did not dare to question it and directly saved the number for her. Then Lily helped Yu and the old lady find a hotel and helped the old lady move things in. Just before Lily left, old Mrs. Shun looked at Lily with a pair of pitiful eyes and said, "You must come, don't leave me." Lily vaguely answered, did not say that she would come, did not say that she would not come. Back at the company, when Lily met with Yi Chanchan, she couldn't help complaining. Lily told him all the helplessness she had felt, starting from when she had saved the old lady. Yi Chanchan was stunned and said, "What a big weirdo. Isn't it?" Lily sighed helplessly. "Anyway, I don't dare to go to her. I feel that I will be blamed. It is not easy to be a good person these days. Be smart, don't stir up so much trouble. Oh, by the way, the girl who was with Li Laosen last time, is she your sister?" "Yes, what's wrong?" "I just thought I saw her. She was with the old lady." "The old lady is Shinluo An's grandmother. Yu was with her just now. When we went to find the hotel, she also went with them." Yi Chanchan was even more shocked and said, "Really, it turned out to be this old lady? Damn it, this old lady is really perverted in her decisiveness. This old woman has been targeting our Yu and treating her very badly. Although I haven't seen her in person, I feel that this old woman is extremely arrogant just by listening to what Yu and my mother said. If it's this old woman, you can't hook up with so many women. What if she goes crazy and bites you?" Lily laughed but did not answer. She was busy until she got off work. During this period, the old lady called Lily many times, but Lily directly ignored her. Yu accompanied the old lady in the hotel and waited for Lily to get off work. The old lady took out her cell phone and made countless calls, but Lily did not answer. Old Mrs. Shun was a little depressed. She leaned against the window of the hotel and looked out. She looked very gloomy. Her manager and good friend Mira had already called her countless times, but she didn't dare answer any of them. She looked at the time. She had to go to work at 6:30 p.m., but she was worried about leaving the old lady here alone. She glanced at the old lady and wanted to call Shin Manting or Shinjilia, but she didn't dare to. If the old lady knew about it, she might scold her even more. By that time, Brother Luo, and would be even more. Don't you have something to do? Then go do it. I'll be fine here alone. Chapter 1000. Old Mrs. Shun was a little impatient. She waved her hand and said, "Do you think I'm a child? Go." Yu didn't stay any longer. She left the hotel and took a taxi. Yu arrived at the recording site at 6 o'clock. She put on makeup and got ready just in time for the recording. After about 2 hours, the recording was over. After it was over, Yu found that Shin Luo and had called her several times. She was ecstatic and immediately called him back. Shin Luo and picked up the phone, but his voice was a little gloomy. He said, "Yu, where did you take Grandma?" Hearing this tone, Yuyu's original joy suddenly seemed to be poured down by a basin of cold water, and it suddenly cooled down a lot. "Grandma said she wanted to come to Kingstown, but she didn't let me tell you so. So you took Grandma to Kingstown? Yuyu, are you crazy? You are an actress. You have to film every day. How can you have time to take care of Grandma? Do you want Grandma to go with you to film?" Actress. Those two words brought a great deal of humiliation to Yuyu. The Shin family was like this. They called her profession an actress and said it with a contemptuous tone. However, Yuyu thought that Shin Luo and was different. After all, he had never said such words in front of her. But at this moment, Yuyu felt very uncomfortable and defended, "Brother Luo, and I'm an actress, not an actress. What's the difference?" Shin Luo and asked with a sneer, "Grandma hates you so much. How can she go to Kingstown with you? How did you trick her?" No matter what, you have to bring Grandma home right now. Dad and Mom are going crazy. Do you know how serious the consequences will be if you act so insensibly?" Shin Luo and sounded very angry. "You're the one who brought Grandma home. Grandma is fine in the hotel. She won't." Yu tried to explain, but Shin Luo and didn't give her a chance to speak at all. "Yu, I know Grandma doesn't like you and you're very upset, but it's not a good way to please the old people. Now Mom and Dad are very angry about this matter. You'd better bring her back quickly. Yu, I know Grandma doesn't like you and you're very upset, but it's not the right way to please the old people." Yuyu's heart felt as if it had been pried open. She felt extremely uncomfortable. All right. On the way back to the hotel, Yu tried to organize the words in her head. She hoped that the old lady wouldn't scold her too harshly. When she reached the hotel, she realized that the old lady had disappeared. Yuyu's heart skipped a beat, and her expression changed drastically. He turned around and went to the bathroom, the balcony, and after looking around he did not find the old lady. The suitcase was nowhere to be seen, but the hotel key card was still in the room. Her face immediately turned pale. Thinking of the time when the old lady sneaked into Kingstown and almost got into trouble, her heart felt like it was going to fly out. He called the old lady, but the robotic female voice indicated that the other party's phone was turned off. "It's over, it's over, it's over, it's over." If something really happened to old Mrs. Shun, the Shuns would never let her off. How could Shin Luo and let her off? What should he do? Chapter 1001. Since the old lady likes you Lily so much, she must have gone to find you Lily, right? But I don't have you Lily's cell phone number at all. What should I do? In a panic, Yu thought of Yi Chanchan. Yi Chanchan seems to live with you Lily, right? When Yi Chanchan received Yuyu's call, she was sitting on the sofa watching a Korean drama. Seeing Yuyu's call, she immediately picked it up and was ready to ask her about the strange things that happened today. But Yuyu's first sentence was, "Sister, is your roommate there?" "Yes." Yi Chanchan was a little confused. "Why are you looking for her? Let her answer the phone. I have something to talk to her about." Yi Chanchan took the phone and immediately jumped to Yu Lily's room. She knocked on the door and walked in, then gave the phone to her. "Hello, I'm Yu. We met at the train station today," Yu said. Yu Lily knew who she was and asked, "What's wrong? Have you seen my grandmother? I just went to work and when I came back I found that she was gone, and her phone was turned off." As she spoke, Yu Lily could clearly hear the panic in her voice. "You saved her last time. If something happened to her on the road this time?" Yu Lily was shocked. She also knew that this was not a trivial matter, so she comforted her. "Don't worry too much. Let's split up and go to the places where the old lady might go. Does she know anyone here?" "Yes. Shin Manting and Shinjilia." All of a sudden, Yu thought of them and said, "I'll call them. It's my aunt and uncle." "Okay." While talking on the phone, Yu Lily also stood up, put on a coat and said, I'll also go out to look for her. If there is any news, let's inform each other. Thank you. Yi was about to cry. After hanging up the phone, Yu Lily briefly explained the situation to Yi Qian and went out to look for her. Speaking of the places where the old lady might go, the first thing that came to Yu Lily's mind was the busy street where she saved the old lady last time. Yu Lily didn't understand why the old lady liked her so much. But, if she guessed correctly, the old lady's disappearance was likely to be looking for her. Yu Lily and Yi Qian immediately headed in that direction. As expected, when Yu Lily reached the road, she saw old Mrs. Shen sitting on her suitcase by the roadside. That place was where the old lady had been lying the last time Yu Lily had found her. Yu Lily felt a little speechless, but she immediately went forward and called out, Grandma, so you're here. When old Mrs. Shen saw Yu Lily, her eyes immediately lit up and she shouted, Miss Lily, you're here. Oh, I've been waiting for you for a long time. Why are there so many mosquitoes in such cold weather in Kingstown? Because this is the South. It's different from the North. Yu Lily was a little helpless. She helped her pull up the suitcase and said, I'll take you back to the hotel. Miss Yi is looking for you urgently. Chapter 1002. Yi Qian felt very puzzled when she heard the old lady's words. Yu Lily doesn't seem to know this old woman well, does she? Yi was right. That old woman was sick in the head. Yu Lily was a little embarrassed. She immediately changed the topic and said, Have you eaten? Old Mrs. Shen was moved. She shook her head and said, No, I'm so hungry. Yu Lily was speechless. Yi Qian picked up her mobile phone and called Yi Yu. After telling her the address, she found a restaurant with Yu Lily and sat down. The old lady hadn't eaten yet. As soon as she arrived at the restaurant and ordered, she immediately began to eat. When Yi Yu arrived, there were two people following behind her. Shen Manting and Shen Jielia. When Yi Qian saw Shen Jielia, her eyes lit up and she shouted, It's you. What are you doing here? Shen Jielia was also surprised to see her and said, I'm here to see my grandmother. Do you know my grandmother? Yi Qian's eyes widened. Your grandmother? Isn't she Yi Yu's grandmother? Oh, Yi Yu is my sister-in-law. Yi Qian should be glad that she didn't drink water. Otherwise, she would have spat it out at this moment. The world is so big but the circle is so small. Shen Jielia is actually Yi Yu's uncle? In other words, he is Shen Luo, Anne's younger brother? Oh my god, how could there be such a coincidence? Uncle, do you know my sister? Yi Yu came up from behind. After seeing that the old lady was safe and sound, she quietly breathed a sigh of relief. When Shen Jielia heard Yi Yu shout, he felt a little strange. Is she your sister? So, we are relatives by marriage, ha? Shen Jielia laughed, looked at Yu Lily and said, Where did you find my grandmother? I didn't know that you were the kind-hearted person who saved my grandmother last time. My grandmother also likes you very much. It seems that we are really destined to be together. It's a waste of this heaven-sent opportunity if we don't get together. Yu Lily took a sip of milk tea, rolled her eyes at him and said, Take your grandmother away. I'm going back. Shen Manting stepped forward and glanced at the old lady who was still eating. She said, Grandma, do you know that my parents are worried sick about you in the capital? You are too capricious. Old Mrs. Shen ignored her. She looked at Yu Lily and said, This restaurant doesn't taste good. Next time take me to one that tastes good. Shen Manting was a little upset and looked at Yu Lily indignantly. Not only did this woman steal her man, but even her grandmother liked her a little more. What? Grandma, it's time to go back. Let's go to my villa. It's the villa Oming gave me. It's big and comfortable. Let's live together, okay? Shen Manting coaxed. However, old Mrs. Shen didn't buy it at all. She said, You can go back. I've already told Lily that I'll sleep with her today. You don't have to worry about me. Yu Lily almost choked on her milk tea. She turned to look at old Mrs. Shen and said, Grandma, you should go back with them. It's not convenient for me. The room is too small. It can't accommodate a great Buddha like you. But she didn't finish her sentence. Old Mrs. Shen looked at Yu Lily and asked with a hint of resentment, Do you dislike me? Yes. Chapter 1003. No matter how stupid old Mrs. Shen was, she knew that Yu Lily had acquiesced. Just a moment ago he had a look of anticipation on his face, but now he had collapsed. Such a change in expression was seen by everyone. Yu Lily felt a little guilty, but she still hardened her heart and looked away. Seeing this, Shen Manting snorted and said, How cruel. Sure enough, a person who is willing to sell herself is also hard-hearted. Yu Lily looked up at her with cold eyes. Shen Manting saw her expression and felt a little proud in her heart. She said, I heard that you broke up with Ming, but you have been Ming's mistress for so many years. Even if you don't have any credit, you have worked hard. You should also attend Ming's wedding. As she said this, she opened her bag and took out a stack of beautiful red booklets. There is no name on it. You can write it yourself and take it out directly. Mistress. Yi Chanshan and Yi Yu didn't know this. They looked at each other and saw surprise in each other's eyes. Other guests next to them heard it and also looked over curiously. Yu Lily's face darkened and her eyes turned cold. She sneered and said, Miss Shin really has a big heart. You're preparing for your wedding and at the same time, you're trying to get another man to play the taboo game. Isn't it cool to be two-timing? Hearing this, Shin Manting's hand trembled violently, and her face changed dramatically. She looked at Yu Lily incredulously. It was impossible. Shin Luo, and only showed that side to her when no one was around, and Yu Lily was not familiar with her. Did she get the news from Shin Luo? Shin Manting's breathing became rapid, and her hand holding the invitation suddenly tightened. However, she quickly pretended to be calm and sneered, What do you mean by this? You know very well what I mean. Yu Lily looked at her, stood up, and raised her eyebrows with a smile. I'll go back first. Take care of yourself. Yu Lily quickly walked out. Seeing this, Yi Chanshan quickly followed. Holding the blank invitation, Shin Manting's face quickly changed and became extremely ugly. Shin Jilya looked at Shin Manting and asked in a low voice, Is it true? You have another man? Shin Manting's breathing quickened and she shouted, Shut up. She stomped her foot and turned to leave. Yu felt a little strange. Yu Lily's words kept echoing in her mind, taboo. Yi Chanshan knew that Yu Lily's ex-boyfriend was Ming, but she didn't know that Yu Lily was a sugar baby. Subconsciously, Yi Chanshan thought of the plot in Yu Lily's manga. It seemed that the female protagonist was kept by the male protagonist, but in her heart, there was always a villain who resisted. Could it be that Yu Lily was painting her own story? However, when Yi Chanshan saw Yu Lily's expression, she didn't say anything. She quietly followed Yu Lily back home. However, as soon as she got out of the elevator, she saw a man standing in front of her house. A tall and handsome figure was standing at the door with a cigarette between his long fingers, which was emitting faint white smoke. When Yi Chanshan saw Ming, she felt even more perplexed. She had just heard that Shin Manting was two-timing, but what was the difference between Ming and Shin Manting now? Yi Chanshan felt that it was unfair for Yu Lily. When she saw Ming, she didn't say anything. She took out her key and asked in a low voice, It can't be true, right? You have another man? Shin Manting breathed quickly and shouted, Shut up. Shin Manting stomped her foot and turned to leave. Yu felt a little strange. Yu Lily's words kept echoing in her mind, taboo. Yi Chanshan knew that Yu Lily's ex-boyfriend was Ming, but she didn't know that Yu Lily was a sugar baby. Subconsciously, Yi Chanshan thought of the plot in Yu Lily's manga. It seemed that the female protagonist was kept by the male protagonist, but in her heart, there was always a villain who resisted. Could it be that Yu Lily was painting my own story? However, when she saw Yu Lily's expression, Yi Chanshan didn't say anything. She silently followed Yu Lily back home. When she got out of the elevator, she saw a man standing in front of her house. The tall and handsome figure was standing at the door with a cigarette between his long fingers, which was emitting faint white smoke. When Yi Chanshan saw Ming, she felt even more perplexed. She had just heard that Shin Manting was two-timing, but what was the difference between Ming and Shin Manting now? Chapter 1004. The atmosphere was so quiet that it was a little strange. Yu Lily had not looked at him until now, as if he did not exist. Yi Chanshan was a little scared, and her hand that was opening the door was shaking. Finally, Yi Chanshan opened the door and breathed a sigh of relief. She immediately slipped in. But when Yu Lily was about to go in, Ming suddenly took her hand behind her and said, Let's talk. Yu Lily tried to pull her hand back, but she couldn't. She turned her head and looked at Ming. Under Ming's eyes, there was a layer of light blue compared to a few days ago, and he looked a little tired. On his clean and white face there was a serious look. Yu Lily slightly raised her lips and smiled. There is nothing to talk about between us, Master O. You think too highly of me. There was a smile in her voice and words. There was not the slightest bit of unfriendliness in his tone. In fact, there was even a hint of flattery. However, in Ming's ears, he felt that there was an indescribable sarcasm. It seemed that Yu Lily was mocking him and he felt very uncomfortable. Ming's eyes were deeper, and there was a trace of displeasure in his beautiful peach blossom eyes. He said, "Talk properly. Is there anything wrong with me talking like this?" Yu Lily's voice was a little sharp, and even Yi Qianqian felt that her tone was asking for a beating, let alone Ming. Ming's eyes were gloomy and he held her hand tighter and said, "I miss you so much." Yi Qianqian was abused and silently hid aside. Yu Lily's heart was choked and her eyes were slightly hot. She couldn't maintain the smile on her face and she tried to pull her hand back, but Ming didn't let go. Ming stared at her. His peach blossom eyes, which used to be casual and elegant, were now deep. His dark brown pupils seemed to contain a lake, sparkling with the light. "Master O, it's not good for us to be like this." She looked at him with a distant and polite smile on her face. "You know, you are going to get married. Your fiancé just gave me an invitation but I forgot to take it. But when you get married it's better for me not to be there, right?" The smile on Yu Lily's face grew brighter and brighter. She looked at Ming and said, "After all, I'm your former mistress. I'm not even your ex-girlfriend. What kind of identity should I attend the wedding? Even I didn't expect it." Ming's heart ached. He held her hand tightly and said, "There won't be a wedding. Yu Lily, give me some more time. I will do what I said." He had said that he would marry her and make her his wife. But he couldn't do it, could he? The Shen family and the O family were well matched in social status, and Ming's mother liked Shen Manting very much. What reason did he have not to marry her? Yu Lily had nothing and now she was suffering from sexual apathy. She couldn't give him physical pleasure at all. At best, she could only give him psychological satisfaction. He had a mistress on his left and a wife on his right. What a good life. Yu Lily smiled and pulled her hand back. "No, Master O, I don't dare to expect those things you said. I only have one request for you now." Ming narrowed his eyes and seemed to have guessed something. Chapter 1005. Entangled, Ming's heart seemed to be squeezed tightly, and he couldn't help but feel pain. Yu Lily's smile widened and she said, "You're going to make me feel awkward. When other people ask me, 'Hey Yu Lily, who is this to you?' I won't be able to answer them. Do you know that?" As she said that, Yu Lily's eyes became redder. She tried to smile and gently put her hand on his palm. "So, don't continue." Yu Lily pulled his hand away and her smile was a little stiff. Ming let go of her hand, but raised his hand to hold her shoulder. He clasped her head with his palm, bowed his head and kissed her lips. Yu Lily was shocked by his unexpected action, and her heart suddenly jumped. Ming's hand climbed up her waistline, and he gently sucked her lips, gently and lovingly. Such a kiss had nothing to do with lust. It was just a light kiss and then he released her. "In the future, I won't let you be unable to answer." Ming stroked her face with his big hand and his voice was soft. Yu Lily pushed him away and turned her head. Then she quickly entered the house and closed the door. Yi Qianqian saw Yu Lily come in and blinked. Yu Lily's eyes were red and when she saw Yi Qianqian's look she smiled. "Are you in a cold war?" Yi Qianqian looked at her and asked. "Cold war?" When a couple or a husband and wife ignored each other because of a quarrel, it was called a cold war. But she and Ming, they were not a couple nor a husband and wife, were they? When Yu Lily heard that she sneered and said, "There is no cold war. It's just a breakup." After that Yu Lily walked into her room. Seeing that, Yi Qianqian sighed and said, "Ask the world what is love. It makes people live and die for each other." For a period of time, Ming didn't appear again. Yu Lily began to take on the work of the editor, and her performance was much worse than Yi Qianqian's. She was praised by Editor-in-Chief Zhou several times, and she even held a celebration party for her. After old Mrs. Shen stopped pestering her, Shenjilia's pursuit became more and more aggressive. In the past he would only wait for her at the company after work, but recently, it had evolved into squatting at the entrance of the neighborhood. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Yu Lily would be followed by Shenjilia. Shenjilia smiled brightly and said, "Hello, you're running in the morning too? What a coincidence." Yu Lily just wanted to laugh, so she mercilessly exposed him. "The neighborhood you live in is half an hour's drive from here. You run really fast. Awesome." Shenjilia didn't seem to realize that he had been ridiculed. He laughed out loud and even looked a little proud of himself. He said, well said, well said. Shall we have breakfast together later?" "No, I'm going to buy one for Qianqian." "Okay, then I'll go to your house to eat." Shenjilia replied calmly, "That's all. I'll take you to work afterward. It's on the way." "What bullsh*t?" She rolled her eyes at him and quickened her pace. Shinjilia was tall and had long legs, so he easily caught up with her. He overtook her by half and said, "By the way, has the illness you went to see improved?" Sexual apathy. Chapter 1006. Are you concerned about me? Shinjilia raised his eyebrows proudly. He was not discouraged when Lily rolled her eyes at him. That's our hospital. I can go if I want. I'll come back after a formality. You don't have to be so serious. Oh really? That's great. Obviously, she didn't want to continue the conversation. Shinjilia quickly changed the topic and said, "To be honest, your problem can't be ignored. If a woman has this problem, it must be treated." Lily didn't answer. She panted and ran faster. Lily stared at the front, but as she ran, her stomach became more and more painful. Frowning, Lily slowed down a little. Shinjilia followed her very easily and said, "I'm serious. Maybe it will cause menstruation. If it is more serious, it may cause problems with the uterus. It is obviously a psychological factor, but the body is closely related to the mood, so it can't be ignored. I happen to be free recently, so I'll treat it for you." "Shut up!" Lily roared. Her stomach hurt even more. She turned her head and shouted, "You're so noisy." Shinjilia immediately shut up and looked at her figure in a very good mood. But he found that Lily's footsteps were getting slower and slower. Shinjilia followed her. Seeing Lily like this, he slightly raised his eyebrows and asked, "What's wrong?" Lily frowned and shook her head. Her lower abdomen was cramping. She took a breath, but the original pain became more painful. Lily couldn't help but squat down, holding her stomach. Seeing her like this, Shinjilia also knew that the situation couldn't be underestimated. He reached out and touched her forehead. It was very cold and there was a thin layer of cold sweat. Lily's breathing became more and more rapid. Her body seemed to be pressed by a heavy weight. She reached out and grabbed his hand. Shinjilia was even more shocked and asked, "What's wrong?" Lily's eyes became darker and darker, and her head became heavier and heavier. Lily pushed him away, turned her head, and vomited. However, she only vomited a few mouthfuls of water and stomach acid. Shinjilia saw that, patted her on the back and said, "You can't do this. I'll take you to the hospital." Lily didn't answer. She squatted on the ground and felt dizzy. It took a while for him to recover. Lily grabbed Shinjilia's hand with both of her hands and helped him stand up. Her head was dizzy and she was about to fall. Shinjilia picked her up in his arms and ran to the back. He placed her in his car and drove to a nearby hospital. The seats in the car were made of white leather. When he picked her up from the seat, Shinjilia noticed the red stain on the seat. Lily squinted her eyes and looked half asleep. She looked very uncomfortable. Shinjilia finally understood that the woman was on her period. However, would there be such a big reaction during menstruation? All of the girlfriends he had had in the past were still full of energy during their periods. At most, they would pretend to be weak and weak. This was the first time Shinjilia had seen someone like this. Chapter 1007. Shinjilia was a little confused. He thought for a moment and turned to look at Lily. Lily was lying on the bed, weak, and her eyes were blacking out. Hearing this, she said, "Yes, I had a miscarriage." Abortion or medical abortion? Medical abortion. Well, women should take care of their own bodies. Medical abortion is the most harmful to the body. You haven't recovered yet. How many times has it been like today? Lily looked at the ceiling dizzily and said, "I don't know how many times, but occasionally, it's better than this situation." The doctor gave Lily some medicine and said, "Have you seen a doctor? This kind of situation should be taken seriously. You can't underestimate it. Maybe you can't get pregnant. You need to find a Chinese medicine practitioner to take good care of it." Then she looked at Shinjilia with some blame and said, "A man should look after a woman and take care of her. How can she not recover?" After the infusion, Lily's head was buzzing. When she heard the doctor's words, she had no strength and spirit. She slowly closed her eyes and fell asleep unconsciously. When she woke up, Shinjilia was at the bedside. Seeing Lily wake up, he seemed a little surprised and said, "You're awake? I just made brown sugar water. Drink some." Lily blinked and looked at Shinjilia, feeling a little confused. Then she remembered something and was shocked, shouting, "What time is it now?" "It's after 10 o'clock. Shinjilia looked at his watch, but when he saw Lily's horrified look, he laughed and said, "Don't worry, Yi Chanchan has already asked for leave for you and explained the situation. What do you want to eat? I'll buy it for you." Lily breathed a sigh of relief, but her lower abdomen still hurt. Hearing Shinjilia's words, she shook her head. Just then there was only a little medicine left. The nurse then pulled out the needle and Shinjilia helped Lily up. Lily had been lying for more than 2 hours and felt much better, but she still had no strength and her lower abdomen hurt. Today she was wearing a light blue sports suit, and there was a red mark on the back of her body. Shinjilia saw it, took off his coat and wrapped it around her waist, saying, "I'll take you back. Can you walk?" "Sure. Thank you." Lily put her hand on his and said, "I'll walk slowly." Shinjilia didn't force her. He helped her out of the hospital. However, just as he walked out of the hospital, he saw a Bentley driving over. Lily accidentally glanced at the license plate number and was stunned. She looked up and saw Oming getting out of the car. At that moment, Shinjilia's arms were circling around Lily's. He held her hands with both of his hands as if he was protecting a treasure. Lily also had a men's sports coat tied around her waist. Oming's face darkened. He quickly walked up to her and reached out his hand to grab Lily without saying a word. However, Shinjilia was quick to react. He quickly held Lily in his arms and looked at him with a warning look. "What do you want to do?" Lily was held tightly in Shinjilia's arms. She was caught off guard and looked up at Shinjilia. Shinjilia's face was unspeakably serious. Vaguely, he looked at Oming with a hint of warning and hostility. Chapter 1008. Hearing that, Shinjilia laughed. His laughter was clear, with obvious unhappiness. Lily could clearly feel the vibration of his vocal cords. She wanted to push him away, but her whole body was tightly held, and it was difficult to raise her strength. "I say, brother-in-law, are you mistaken? Shouldn't your woman be my sister, Shin Manting? Now Lily is my girlfriend. Are you trying to steal my future brother-in-law's woman?" Shinjilia's voice was full of laughter. He raised his eyebrows and looked at him with sarcasm and disdain. When Lily heard that, her eyes widened. She looked up at him and shouted, "Shinjilia? Don't talk." Shinjilia lowered his head and looked at her with endless tenderness in his eyes. "Anyway, you have broken up. It's better to make some things clear. Every time he comes to pester you, you feel very annoyed, don't you?" "Yes." However, at the same time there was a strange feeling. She loved him, but she minded that he was not hers alone. She wanted to see him, but she couldn't accept that he was engaged to another woman at the same time. The inexplicable relationship between them was the most confusing. When Oming heard Shinjilia's words, he was so angry that he laughed. He looked at Lily and said in a cold voice, "I heard that you asked for sick leave. What's wrong with you?" Her face was pale, and she snuggled in Shinjilia's arms like an ordinary little woman, like a little bird. She was completely different from when she was facing him. "It has nothing to do with you, brother-in-law." Shinjilia hugged her, and the smile on his face was sinister. "Why do you care so much? My sister is the one who is planning the wedding. If you have the time to care about other women, you might as well take care of your own business. Don't end up in a mess." While speaking, Shinjilia walked forward with Lily in his arms and said, "I'm also doing it for your own good, brother-in-law." Oming stretched out his arms and put them in front of him, but his eyes fell on Lily. His pair of peach blossom eyes were full of doubt and disbelief. He asked, "Is it true?" Lily leaned against Shinjilia's arms and her face was pale. Hearing Oming's obviously uncertain words, her heart was beating fast. Really? What would happen to him if what she said was true? If what she said wasn't true, then there was no doubt that Oming would go back and forth and worry about both sides. As for her, she was still Oming's woman, a pitiful mistress whom everyone looked down upon. Lily looked at him and hugged him tightly. She buried her face in his chest and whispered, "Let's go. I feel terrible." There was no direct answer. He did not say it was true, nor did he say it was false. But in Oming's eyes, such an attitude was tantamount to a tacit agreement. Shinjilia's big eyes were shining. He raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Oming in front of him. He said, "Sorry, brother-in-law, you are in the way." He tried to push Oming's hand away, but Oming twisted it and grabbed Shinjilia's hand. He looked at Lily in anger and sneered, "I haven't seen you for 2 days, and you can't wait to throw yourself into the arms of another man. Lily, are you so lonely?" His ruthless and sharp words were like thousands of sharp blades stabbing into Lily's heart, ruthless and decisive. Chapter 1009. He was really angry, but what did it have to do with her? When Lily heard Oming's words, she laughed and said, "Mr. O, did you make a mistake?" Oming was even angrier when he heard that. He looked at her and said nothing. We broke up a long time ago, didn't we? Yu Lily looked at him expressionlessly, and her body felt weak. Even if she wanted to make a disdainful expression, she felt too weak to do so. Now, the person who pesters me is you, and the person who wants to marry me is you. In the past, it was you who ended the relationship first. Why do you have the final say? I will also be tired, Ming. As she said that, she closed her eyes and leaned on Shinjilia's chest. I didn't agree. Ming looked at her. She was obviously uncomfortable and her face was pale. Ming felt sad. I didn't agree, Yu Lily. The reason why I let you go is that I want you to calm down. I didn't want you to break up with me. You think too highly of yourself. Yu Lily smiled gently. She was indescribably weak, but the words she said were like cold and sharp, stabbing into Ming's heart. Yu Lily. Ming was furious, but when he saw her like this, he forcibly suppressed his anger and reached out his hand. Give her to me. But how could Shinjilia be obedient? Holding Yu Lily, Shinjilia clearly noticed that Yu Lily was about to lose her strength again. His face darkened and he shouted, Go away. Don't you see that she is uncomfortable? You made her so uncomfortable for 4 years, and now you don't let her go back to rest. How dare you say you love her? Ming, you are so shameless. Shinjilia carried Yu Lily in his arms and strode in the direction of his car. Ming was left standing in the same place and his head was buzzing. So uncomfortable for 4 years? What does that mean? He carefully put her in the back seat of the car and let her lie down. After Shinjilia put her down, he went to the driver's seat and started the car. In front, Ming came over and stood beside the car, his eyes staring at Yu Lily in the back seat. Shinjilia sneered, looked away and whispered, You are so shameless. Yu Lily heard it clearly in the back. She squinted her eyes and leaned against the car. When they got home, Shinjilia took out the keys from her pocket and keyed in the password before gently placing her on the bed. After boiling some water, Shinjilia rummaged through the entire kitchen and finally found some brown sugar. He made some brown sugar water for her and blew on it to cool it down before helping her drink it. Yu Lily knew that the man was Shinjilia and she felt guilty. He opened his eyes and said, You go back first, I can do it alone. No, I haven't eaten yet. We agreed to eat together. Shinjilia glanced at his watch. It was already past 11 o'clock. He clicked his tongue and said, But I'm afraid breakfast is out of the question. What do you want to eat for lunch? What are you doing? Shinjilia's face reddened. He coughed lightly and said, I'll go buy it. I don't know how to cook. Yu Lily smiled and shook her head. I can't eat. Then I'll just buy something. When I ring the doorbell later, you can open the door for me. All right. Shinjilia was secretly happy to hear her answer. Normally, no matter how much he shouted or knocked on the door, the two women wouldn't open it. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.